Hey guys, welcome back to the Red Bed. Today I've got over 3 hours of real life Reddit stories for you to chill with, whether you're falling asleep, relaxing, or just want something playing in the background. Most of these dive into revenge, with some family drama mixed in too. And while you listen, I'll be sharing some hardcore gameplay I got today, where I meet up with everyone at my starter base, go on a long adventure with my friends to hopefully find a new area to build, and to switch things up a little, I'll also be sharing my friend's gameplay later in the vid, just to show another player's perspective in our hardcore world. Also, I'm trying to post these videos daily, so if you're enjoying them, consider dropping a sub. But anyways, kick back, relax, and enjoy. This first story is about a teenager who tried to save a little money while picking up their green card, only to end up in a bizarre situation surrounded by armed officers at the border. Back when I was 17, I had to pick up my American green card. Since I'm Canadian, the only way to get it was to physically go to a border crossing. The closest one to me was across a massive bridge. Pretty sure it was the Rainbow Bridge near Lewiston. At that age, I didn't want to bother paying the toll for the bridge, so I came up with what I thought was a clever plan. I parked my car on the Canadian side and decided I'd just walk across. At first it felt fine, but about halfway along, I realized there weren't any sidewalks or pedestrian paths. It was literally just me walking along this bridge made for cars, and I started to wonder if this was even allowed. But by that point, I was already too far in. I figured I might as well keep going. When I got closer to the American side, things got intense really fast. Out of nowhere, about 15 uniformed officers started heading straight toward me. And these weren't just casual border staff, they were carrying machine guns. My stomach dropped, but I tried to act like nothing was wrong. I told myself, just play it cool, pretend they're out on a routine patrol. So I kept walking, trying to look normal. It didn't work. They surrounded me quickly, weapons slung, and started asking me questions. They wanted to know why I was there and what I thought I was doing. I explained that I was there to pick up my green card, but they didn't seem impressed by that. They brought me into the immigration office, and I sat there for what felt like forever, probably 2 hours. They kept asking things, taking notes, just trying to make sense of why some teenager was walking across an international bridge. Eventually, they gave me the green card. But the funny part was, they still didn't seem to know what to do with me. One of them finally said something like, "We don't know how you even got here like this, but I guess just walk back." So that's what I did. I walked back across the bridge the same way I came. No sidewalks, just pretending it was normal. When I got back to the Canadian side, it got even stranger. Since I wasn't in a car, I literally stood in line with the vehicles waiting to cross. When the lane finally cleared, I walked right up to the booth like I was a car. As soon as I did, an alarm went off. My first thought was, here we go again. But this time it was nothing like the American side. Two young Canadian officers came over, smiling. One of them asked, almost laughing, "Did you just walk the bridge?" I explained the whole story about the US officers and the immigration office. They just burst out laughing. One of them gave me a pat on the back, checked my passport quickly, and let me through without any fuss. After all that chaos, it ended with a laugh and me heading home, finally holding my green card. That's the end of the story. That story is hilarious in the most chaotic way. Only a teenager would think walking across a car bridge to dodge a toll made sense. It's wild how serious the American side took it, compared to the Canadian side just laughing it off. Honestly, it feels like one of those stories you look back on and can't believe actually happened. This next story is about a birthday celebration that was meant to be fun and relaxed, but ended up strained when friends ignored warnings and brought their baby to events that weren't kid-friendly. Last weekend was my husband's 35th birthday, and we had two special things planned. Friday night was going to be a dinner at a unique little restaurant, and Sunday we had tickets to an outdoor festival we both look forward to every year. We invited two friends of ours, who happen to have a 1-year-old daughter. From the beginning, I explained that neither of these events was really suited for kids. The restaurant in particular is small and intimate, with all the seats lined up around the chef's workspace. There's no menu, no kids options, and definitely no space for high chairs. It's one of those experiences where you go for the chef's creativity, as much as for the food itself. To make sure they understood, I even sent them the restaurant's website. The festival wasn't much different in that regard. It's set up outdoors in the woods, so it's not stroller-friendly at all. Children are technically allowed, but it's definitely more of an adult event. The thing is, these friends had already been to the festival with us before, so they knew exactly what it was like. I told them both events weren't baby friendly and said it was totally fine if they wanted to skip this year. But they told us they'd be there for both, so I assumed the grandparents, who lived nearby, would be babysitting. Friday night arrived, and when they showed up to the restaurant, they brought the baby. Since I hadn't included her in the reservation, there was no setup for her. With no high chairs, she had to sit on her mom's lap the whole night. You could tell her mom wasn't enjoying it. She seemed frustrated that she couldn't eat properly and made comments about the lack of a kid's menu. The atmosphere got tense. The baby cried at one point, and her mom had to leave the table to step outside. Her husband even asked me to go check on her. By the time the meal wrapped up, the whole night just felt dampened. They left quickly after dinner, saying we'd meet again Sunday at the festival. And then Sunday came. Once again, they brought their baby. Right from the start, it became clear how difficult it was going to be. The stroller didn't handle the wooded paths, so we were constantly stopping while the baby needed to be fed, changed, or comforted. Every time we suggested splitting up and meeting later, we even offered to share our location, they seemed annoyed by the idea. That left us sticking together, but it meant sacrificing a lot of what we wanted to see. We ended up spending most of the time sitting under a tent instead of exploring. There were whole sections of the festival we couldn't get to because of the stroller. At one point, I was literally holding the baby so her mom could feed her. The entire day felt like it revolved around childcare instead of enjoying the festival. And again, this wasn't new to them. They come to this same event in previous years and knew exactly what to expect. The next day, I got a text from her saying she'd had fun and apologizing if the baby ruined things. I tried to be honest but kind, saying it wasn't ruined, but it was frustrating since we'd warned them and missed out on a lot. Since the festival only happens once a year, it's not like we can go back. She didn't take it well. She replied that they're parents now and their baby is their priority. Since then, we haven't spoken and it's been awkward. I can't help but feel guilty, wondering if I should have just kept quiet. That's where the story ends. That whole situation sounds draining. It's tough when you picture a celebration one way and it ends up turning into something completely different. I think a lot of people can relate to that feeling of being stuck in plans that don't play out how you hoped. Sometimes you just walk away more tired than anything else. It makes you realize how important it is when everything actually lines up the way you imagined. This next story is about a trip to Brazil, where one person planned everything and acted as the group's translator, only to be dismissed until their friends realized just how much they relied on them. Back in November of 2024, I went on a trip to Brazil with 3 friends, Natalie, Kylie, and Kylie's husband Gabe. The main reason I wanted to go was because of a music festival I'd been dying to attend for years. I'd always hesitated to go alone since I'm more comfortable traveling with a group, especially in a foreign country with huge crowds. When I mentioned the idea to Natalie and Kylie, they were thrilled. I showed them the lineup, the city, the places we could explore, and they were just as excited as I was. This city was special to me because I had studied there for a year in the past. It was the first place where I truly felt like myself, free to stop worrying about what people thought of me. It had gorgeous beaches, lively culture, and even my old host family still living there. So I was excited to not just enjoy the festival, but also introduce my friends to all of that. Every time I brought up a spot we could visit, they'd reply with things like, "Oh my gosh, I can't wait to see it in person." There was never any talk of splitting up. It was always about enjoying the trip together. Out of the 4 of us, I was the only one who spoke Portuguese. That made me the go-to translator, which I didn't mind. I asked them if there were any specific places they wanted to check out, and Natalie and Kylie found this island online. It was just off the coast, but because it was part of a marine preservation area, the only way to visit was by hiring a local fisherman's boat. Since the fisherman only spoke Portuguese, I spent days on WhatsApp setting everything up, finding someone, arranging the date, confirming the time. I translated all the details into English for them so everyone knew what to expect. But then came the moment that set the tone for the trip. On our very first day, whenever we went somewhere with a menu, Kylie would whip out a translation app instead of asking me. I still offered to translate, but at one point she made this comment that stuck with me. She said, "I travel internationally all the time. You really just need Google Translate. It's not perfect, but between that and hand gestures, everyone understands fine. You don't really need a translator." That stung. I brushed it off, but it definitely put me off. Saturday, things got worse. We'd planned to take a short trip out of town to visit a Brazilian jiu-jitsu school, since Kylie and Gabe both had about 10 years of training. The plan was to spend maybe 4 hours there, then get back in time for the last night of the festival. We agreed to split an Uber there and back, but when the time came, they changed their minds. They told me I could go back without them, but I didn't want to leave my friends stranded in a foreign city. So I stayed. 4 hours turned into 8, and by the time we got back, everyone was too tired to go to the festival. I was frustrated. Half a day gone, and I stayed behind out of loyalty. When we got back to the Airbnb, I was even more thrown off. Kylie and Natalie suddenly came out dressed up in jewelry and dresses. They told me an Uber was waiting to take them to dinner and said, "Have fun at the festival." I reminded them that I wasn't going without them, but it didn't matter. They left, telling me I could meet up with them later if I wanted. At that point, I snapped a little. I told them communication had been terrible, and I was sick of it. Still, I ended up calling my own Uber and meeting them at the restaurant, but the whole thing left me feeling excluded and annoyed. Now, here's where the petty revenge comes in. The next morning, Sunday, I woke up early. This was supposed to be the day of our island trip, the one I had organized with the fishermen, but after the way they treated me, I realized I needed to put myself first. My mental health had taken a hit, and I didn't want to waste another day being dragged around. So I texted them that I wouldn't be joining the island trip, that I wanted to spend the day visiting places that meant something to me before the trip ended. I left and headed for the beach, relaxed for the first time in days. Not long after, my phone buzzed. Kylie and Natalie were asking me for all the details about the boat. Luckily, I had just received a confirmation text the night before in Portuguese, so I forwarded it to them. Then they asked for more information, so I sent them another message I had gotten in Spanish, and that was all they got. No explanations, no hand-holding. They had told me plenty of times that Google Translate and gestures were all anyone needed, so I let them test it out for themselves. Later that night, I asked Natalie how the trip went. She admitted they missed the boat entirely because they didn't realize how far away it was. The island never happened for them. I just smiled to myself. Maybe it wasn't the most savage revenge in the world, but knowing that they dismissed me as unnecessary, only to completely fail without me, was satisfying in its own way. That story wraps up here. There's something really funny about people downplaying how important someone is, only to get a reality check the second they're on their own. Those friends thought Google Translate and a little confidence would carry them through, but they underestimated how much work goes into navigating a place you don't understand. It's petty revenge, sure, but it's also kind of poetic. Sometimes letting people fend for themselves says more than anything you could have explained to them. This next story is about a roommate who tried to squeeze money out of someone over a tiny mistake, turning an already awkward living situation into something even pettier. Back when I was living with two people I considered friends, things were fine for the most part, until little moments started to chip away at the friendship. The turning point came after they threw a New Year's party at our house. I wasn't around for it since I had plans with other friends, but when I got back on January 3rd, the house looked exactly like you'd expect after a party. Nothing extreme, just empty bottles, sticky counters, and trash left sitting around. I figured they'd clean it eventually, but by January 6th the mess was still there. So I gave up waiting and decided to clean it myself. As I was working my way through the living room and kitchen, I noticed some broken glass on the floor. I picked it up and realized it was from one of my wine glasses. A pretty nice one too, gifted to me by my girlfriend's mom. I wasn't furious about it. Accidents happen, especially when alcohol is involved. But what annoyed me was that neither of my roommates had said a word. They just left the evidence for me to discover while sweeping up after them. I kept going, clearing away bottles with a bit of liquid left in them, dumping them out and tossing them in the bin. One of those bottles was a half-finished Lucozade Sport with maybe 200 milliliters left. It looked exactly like all the other abandoned drinks, so I poured it out and chucked it. No big deal, or so I thought. A couple of days later, one of my roommates asked if I'd seen a Lucozade bottle around. I told her I had tossed it with the rest of the rubbish. That's when she dropped the surprise. Apparently, it wasn't actually Lucozade. She had lost the lid to her squash bottle, so she poured it into the Lucozade bottle to keep it. I had unknowingly thrown out her stash. I immediately apologized, telling her I thought it was just leftover party junk. She seemed fine with the apology at first, but then she hit me with, "Could you replace it? Cost of living crisis." At first I thought she was joking, but no. She seriously wanted me to replace the squash I had poured down the sink while cleaning up after her mess. Trying to be fair, I agreed. But since I had just gone shopping, I wasn't planning another trip soon. Instead, I texted her and said I'd send her 50 pence through Splitwise, the app we use for household expenses, so she could pick up another bottle when she went out. But she countered. She actually asked for £1 instead because she claimed it had been half a bottle, and the full bottle cost £2. At that point, my patience wore thin. I was already going above and beyond by cleaning up after her party, throwing out bottles she left lying around, and offering her 50 pence for what was basically her mistake in the first place. But now she wanted to haggle me over an extra 50p? I marched downstairs, frustrated, and told her she could take the 50 pence and nothing more. I made it clear it wasn't about the money. It was about the audacity. Here I was being generous, and she was trying to squeeze more out of me. In my rant, I even brought up the broken wine glass. I hadn't demanded a replacement for something that actually had value because I understood accidents happen. Her response? She immediately offered to pay for the wine glass. She completely missed the point, that I wasn't keeping score over every small mishap. In the end, no money exchanged hands. But the pettiness didn't stop there. Later on, when we'd go out with friends, I'd buy her a drink without thinking about it. But when it came time for her round, she'd demand I pay her back for mine. The imbalance just kept adding up, and it showed me exactly what kind of person I was dealing with. Looking back, it wasn't the biggest deal in the world, but it was one of those little things that sticks with you. The fact that someone could be so petty over 50p while completely ignoring the bigger picture just blew my mind. That's where the story ends. It's wild how quickly small stuff can show you someone's true colors. A broken wine glass got brushed off, but somehow 50 pence for squash was worth turning into a battle. That kind of pettiness isn't really about money. It's about mindset. And honestly, once you notice it, you start to see it everywhere in how that person acts. Sometimes the tiniest arguments are the ones that make you realize who you're actually living with. This next story is about someone who lost a job opportunity after a hiring team dug up old gaming clips and completely misunderstood them. A while back, I was in the middle of a hiring process. I'd already gone through an interview. Things seemed to be moving forward, and I was waiting for a call back to see what the next step would be. Eventually, I did get that call, but the conversation went in a direction I never could have imagined. The HR rep on the other end told me they wouldn't be continuing the process with me. When I asked why, she explained it was because they had found violent photos and videos connected to one of my accounts online. At first I thought there had to be some mistake. All my social media is locked down and private. I don't post graphic stuff. I don't share edgy memes that could be taken the wrong way. None of that. So I asked her which account she was even talking about. That's when she said it was a gaming profile. According to her, there were images and videos where old people and animals were being kicked, along with other violent content. And that's when my jaw just dropped, because I instantly knew what she was talking about. Years ago, I had a Red Dead online account. Like anyone else playing a Rockstar game about outlaws, there were clips of me and some friends robbing trains, going hunting, or just messing around in the world. The videos were mostly tutorials showing how to do things in the game. We weren't cursing people out or saying offensive stuff. We were just doing what the game is literally built around. And somehow, they saw that as real violent content. What really blew my mind wasn't even that they misunderstood. It was that they managed to find this account in the first place. It was over 6 years old. I didn't even have my real name on it. And yet somehow, they dug deep enough through the internet to connect that account to me. It made me paranoid, honestly. If they were able to trace that back, what about all the other random old accounts I don't even remember making? I get that companies want to check digital footprints, but this felt ridiculous. People can get flagged for posting genuinely harmful or violent stuff online, sure. But this was literally video game content from my teenage years. Stuff from a game that millions of people play. And it cost me a chance at a job. That's the end of this story. It's kind of unsettling how deep companies can dig into someone's past online. Imagine losing a job over a game clip where you're just doing what the game was designed for. It really shows how weird digital footprints can be. You might not even remember what's out there, but someone else can still find it. Honestly, It's the kind of thing that makes you think twice about everything you've ever posted, even if it seemed harmless at the time. This next story is about a family trip to Disneyland that took a frustrating turn when a group of entitled teenagers tried to cut the line at one of the most popular rides. About 2 weeks ago, my big extended family decided to take a trip to Disneyland. There were about 22 of us altogether, which made for a really fun but also somewhat chaotic group. My wife and I brought our 3 young kids along, though they're still a little too small to ride the bigger attractions. Luckily, with a group that large, we could easily split up. Some adults stayed with the kids, while others got the chance to go on the bigger rides. When it came time for our turn, my wife and I headed over to Smuggler's Run in Star Wars, Galaxy's Edge. The posted wait time was around 45 minutes, which we thought was manageable. We got in line, excited for the ride, and settled in for the wait. About halfway through the line, something happened that made me raise an eyebrow. 3 teenage girls came walking up past everyone. One was distracted on her phone, and the other 2 were sipping on drinks, grinning like they owned the place. To be fair, they did at least say "excuse me" as they slid by, but then they hopped over a couple of barriers and went straight up to join some friends who were ahead of us. I figured they must have been coordinating with the girl on the phone. Honestly, I just shrugged it off. It wasn't worth getting worked up over, and once they were out of sight, I didn't think much about it. But then, near the very front of the line, it happened again. My wife and I were next in line to board. We were literally about to walk into the ride area when 3 more teenage girls appeared out of nowhere. They said "excuse me" in the same casual way and slipped right past us. I immediately noticed their matching high school shirts, just like the earlier group. That's when it clicked for me. These were part of the same group of teenagers, and they were trying to join up with the others who had already gotten on the ride. The Disney cast member asked them how many people were in their group. One girl answered 3, another said 6, and the last one just kept smiling, sipping her drink like nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, my wife and I were standing there realizing they had just cut the entire line. After waiting patiently for 45 minutes, I wasn't about to let them take the last seats on the ride right in front of us. So I spoke up. I looked at them and said, "Wow, you girls cut the entire line and expect us to be cool with that?" The worker glanced at me, then at my wife, who backed me up right away and explained that the girls had cut in front of everyone who had been waiting. The cast member stayed calm but firm. She turned to the teens and told them they needed to leave the area and head back to the end of the line like everyone else. The girls' grins dropped instantly. Then the cast member waved my wife and me forward, and we finally stepped onto the ride. After all the waiting and that little moment of drama, it honestly felt like a small victory. I couldn't help but feel a little satisfaction seeing those smug looks disappear. And the ride itself? Totally worth the wait. Smuggler's Run was an awesome experience, and I'd recommend it to anyone going to Disneyland. That story wraps up here. That moment must have felt so satisfying. Waiting in line that long and then almost getting pushed aside would have been frustrating for anyone. I think most people know that feeling when you see someone cut and try to get away with it. Seeing the cast member back you up and send them to the back is one of those little wins that can make the whole day better. This next story is about a summer of reckless fun on the lake that spiraled out of control when a group of friends accidentally ended up stealing a boat. Back in the summer of 2007, I was living in Austin, Texas. I'd fallen in with a group that wasn't exactly my usual crowd. Lots of tattoos, drinking, smoking, and big into skate culture. It wasn't my normal lifestyle, but for those warm months, it was fun, and I just went along with it. One of the things this group loved doing involved Lake Austin. We'd rent a beat-up ski boat, load it down with heavy stuff like sandbags or weights from garage sales, and head out on the water. With all that weight piled in the back, the boat created a bigger wake. Add some people on board, a sketchy surfboard, a short rope, and plenty of drinks, and you had what was basically early wake surfing culture. Every weekend, that's how we spent our time, drinking, smoking, and messing around on the lake. That routine carried on all summer until the last Sunday in August, when everything came to a very sudden and chaotic stop. And no, it wasn't the kind of accident people usually think of when you mix boats, partying, and bad decisions. Nobody got hurt on the propeller or anything like that, but it did go bad in an entirely different way. That day was already different from the start. Instead of the same junky rental boats we'd always used, we ended up with something brand new. A 2007 AIR Nautique with all the bells and whistles, auto-filling ballast sacks instead of sandbags, a booming sound system, cruise control for the boat, and even a passcode ignition. It was a serious upgrade. How did we get our hands on it? That morning, my sister called me from Mexico to tell me that our dad had drunkenly bought a quarter share of the boat at a charity auction the weekend before. Nobody had mentioned it to me until then. She gave me the boat's details, its location, and even the passcode, which she said was 1590. I trusted her completely, and my friends were ecstatic. So we spent the day living it up, out on the lake in style, blasting music, wake surfing behind the boat, passing around beers, and generally acting like idiots. After about 4 hours, though, we were all burned out, half drunk, sun-baked, and ready to head in. That's when someone came up with the idea to do one last victory lap around the busiest stretch of the lake. We set it up with 3 ropes trailing behind, each of us surfing at different lengths while the boat slowly cruised past crowded docks and restaurants. To everyone watching, it must have looked like a wild scene. I noticed people pointing and waving from the dock we had left that morning. My eyesight isn't great, so I thought maybe they were cheering us on, or maybe I was hoping there was someone attractive in the group. Either way, I waved back like a fool. But then my rope went slack, the music cut out, and the whole vibe shifted. I swam back to the boat and climbed on board, and that's when I realized something was wrong. Nobody was talking. My friends were whispering about dumping things, and faint sirens could be heard in the distance. The excited group on the dock turned out to be law enforcement, game wardens, sheriff's deputies, and yes, an actual Texas Ranger. They were all gesturing and yelling at us to cut the engine and put our hands up, and behind them stood a very unhappy family, dogs and cooler in tow, who had planned on using their boat that day. That's when it hit me. We had stolen their boat. It turned out my sister had been right about the details, but wrong about the dock. There were 2 docks, A and B. By complete coincidence, the 4th boat on the right at Dock B was the exact same make, model, and color as the one my dad had bought. And to make matters worse, the real owner hadn't set a unique passcode, meaning literally any random 4 numbers, including the one my sister gave me, started it right up. At that point, adrenaline took over. I jumped behind the wheel, trying to steer the boat in while also pretending we weren't the kind of people who just spent a day partying on someone else's expensive new boat. I figured if we explained calmly, everything would get sorted out. But then one of my friends panicked and jumped off. The sudden weight shift slammed us into a metal rail, tearing off the canopy, a speaker, and some wakeboard clips. On top of that, we had already burned through 80 gallons of gas. By the time I tried to dock, officers were screaming. Next thing I knew, I was face down, zip-tied at the wrists and ankles, with my friends swearing at me like I'd single-handedly ruined their lives. We all begged them to call my sister to clear it up, but of course she was still in Mexico, calling from a hotel phone. When I tried to reach her, it went straight to voicemail. Hours later, she finally called back and confirmed the whole situation. That was the only thing that convinced the officers we weren't actual boat thieves. Because who in their right mind would steal a boat, joyride it all day, and then bring it right back to the dock where they'd taken it? That story wraps up here. The whole chain of events is unbelievable. One wrong dock, and suddenly the entire day flipped into chaos. It's wild how something that started as a carefree summer routine turned into zip ties and police shouting. Honestly, it shows how fast a simple mistake can snowball when timing and bad luck line up just right. This next story is about a tenant fed up with people stealing their reserved parking spot who finally decided to block in a repeat violator and refused to back down when management got involved. It was just after midnight on a Saturday when I came home to find someone parked in my assigned covered parking spot. This wasn't the first time it had happened. I was already irritated because it had become a pattern, and it wasn't like I had other options at that hour. The first time it happened, I had called management to have the car towed, but they told me they don't tow anymore because since it's private property, the management company would have to pay. Their exact words were basically, "tough luck." That's when I realized they weren't going to enforce the rules. So, if I wanted to protect my space, I'd have to handle it differently. That night, instead of calling again, I decided to block the car in. There was a block wall in front of the spot, so with my car pulled in behind them, there was no way for them to move. To be fair, I left notes on my neighbors' doors, explaining what I'd done and letting them know they could knock on my door if they needed me to move my car. The next morning around 10, there was frantic pounding on my door. I answered in my pajamas to find a girl on the verge of a meltdown. She was hysterical, saying she had to get to work and was going to lose her job. I asked her if she knew the spot was reserved, and she admitted she did. Her excuse was that it was late, there were no spaces left, and she didn't want to park on the street because it wasn't safe to walk that far at midnight. I looked at her and asked why she thought it was fine to make me park on the street and walk alone after midnight if she thought it was so unsafe for herself. She didn't have an answer. Instead, she snapped that she was going to have me towed. I just laughed, shut the door, and went back to bed. Not long after, management called me. They told me I was blocking someone in, and if I didn't move my car, they would have me towed. I reminded them of what they'd told me before, how they refused to tow violators because it would cost them money. I told them if they actually had me towed instead of the person who had taken my spot, I'd sue them for failing to enforce the rules and putting me at risk. After all, the reason I parked the way I did was because it was late and unsafe to walk from street parking. I even offered to wait with the car until a tow truck came, then move so they could take the violator's car. Apparently, they passed that message along because management ended up telling the girl, "Tough luck." But that didn't stop her from coming back. She was pounding on my door again, screaming so loudly that other people in the complex started calling management to report some kind of lunatic trying to break into an apartment. The whole scene was spiraling. Then the guy she had spent the night with showed up at my door. She was at the bottom of the stairs, crying so hard she had the hiccups. He looked embarrassed and apologized over and over. He explained that he hadn't realized she had parked in my spot, and management was now threatening to evict him since he already had other issues with them. He even offered me money to make up for the trouble. I told him I didn't need his money. All I wanted was for her to apologize. He nodded, went back down, and told her exactly that. A moment later, she climbed the stairs, tear-streaked and still sniffling, and muttered an apology. I accepted it, moved my car, and finally let them out. That's where the story ends. It's crazy how something as simple as a parking spot can turn into that much chaos. Blocking her in was bold, but it made the point in a way management clearly wasn't willing to. The whole scene with the crying, the apologies, and the neighbors watching must have been surreal. This next story is about a guy who was constantly put down by someone in his friend group and finally found a clever way to get back at him after a houseboat trip. There was this guy in my circle of friends who, for as long as I'd known him, had a habit of being a jerk. Honestly, he treated everyone with some level of disrespect, but with me, it always felt more personal. I don't think I can remember a single time he spoke to me without it being a snarky remark or a put-down. Everyone else seemed to shrug it off, though. Since they'd known him from high school, they excused it by saying, "That's just the way he is." For me, it was exhausting. A few summers ago, the whole group planned a houseboating trip. Right from the start, this guy acted like he was in charge of everything. He wasn't actually leading anything, but he strutted around, power tripping over logistics like it was his responsibility to boss people around. At one point in the group chat, completely unprovoked, he told me and another friend, who he also regularly targeted, that if we didn't read the trip PDF carefully and forgot something, he wouldn't share any of his supplies. On top of that, he said he'd literally throw us off the boat. That's the kind of person he was. Now, my ex-wife couldn't come on this trip, and I had arranged a ride with my brother and his girlfriend. After the trip was over, they wanted to stay and do some sightseeing, but I had work back home. So I needed to find another ride into town. I asked one of my friends if I could go with them, and out of nowhere, this guy came striding up from behind the car to shut it down. He wasn't even part of the conversation, and to make it worse, it wasn't even his car. Finding that out later made me furious. That was the breaking point. I'm a bit of a video editor, and usually when I go on trips, I make a vlog to recap the memories. This time though, I decided my video would have a twist. I was going to erase him completely from it. At first I kept it simple. If he appeared in a scene, I cut around him. If he showed up on the edges of a shot I wanted to use, I zoomed in and cropped him out. But the more I thought about it, the more I wanted it to be obvious that I had intentionally edited him out. I didn't want him to just not appear. I wanted people to notice his absence. So I set out to learn a specific effect, the freeze frame intro style where the video pauses and a character's name pops up beside them. For most editors using After Effects, that would have been simple. But I was working in Sony Vegas, which made the whole process way more complicated. Still, I threw myself into it. I spent 2 or 3 nights staying up late, researching, experimenting, and practicing until I nailed it. The end result was a video where everyone in the group got their moment highlighted. Their name would pop up with a fun freeze frame effect, one by one. Everyone except him. For him, there was nothing. Whenever he appeared, I cut him out or cropped him out completely. His absence became so obvious that it was clear it wasn't an accident. It was by design. When I finished, I was already satisfied. But then I learned something that made me even happier. He had actually been sharing the video around before watching it himself. Assuming it was a fun recap of the trip, people kept asking him why he wasn't in it, wondering what happened. Apparently, he was really upset once he finally realized he'd been cut from the whole thing. To this day, I have no idea what he told people when they asked why he was missing. All I know is that, for once, he wasn't the one putting someone else down. He was the one being left out. That's where this story finishes. There's something strangely satisfying about editing someone out like that. Instead of confrontation, it turned into a quiet way of flipping the script on him. The amount of work that went into learning that effect just to make the point really shows how much it mattered. And the fact that he started sharing the video before realizing what had been done is almost too perfect. It's the kind of petty creativity that leaves a bigger impact than an argument ever could. This next story is about a kid who was constantly teased with a nickname until one day he found a very creative way to get even. When I was around 6 or 7 years old, there was this little kid in my neighborhood, maybe 5 at the time, who always seemed to find me at the playground. For some reason, he made it his mission to annoy me. I wouldn't call it bullying because I was a lot bigger than him and he never really hurt me. But in the eyes of a first grader, months of nonstop pestering felt like years. The thing that drove me the most crazy was his favorite nickname for me, Baby JD. My family called me JD growing up, and all my friends knew me by that nickname, so naturally he picked it up too. But instead of using it normally, he would chant it over and over, like a broken record. Baby JD, Baby JD. He'd sing it, yell it, taunt me with it until eventually I get so frustrated I just went home. He always found a way to ruin the fun. One day though, I decided I'd had enough. I was sitting on the swings by myself, hoping some of my friends would come outside when I spotted him pedaling around the corner of my house. The sky above was already gray. It was Washington after all. But in that moment, it felt like it got even darker. He rolled up on his little training wheel bike and parked himself right near the swings. At first, we exchanged a quick hello. We were kids, not savages. But within a minute, he started up again. Baby JD! Baby JD! I snapped. I pumped my legs, swung hard, and then leapt from the swing, hitting the ground with a loud thud right in front of him. His eyes went wide, and he instinctively backed up, but I stomped once in his direction. I had no intention of actually hurting him. I just wanted to scare him a little. Still, it was enough to make him lose his balance. He toppled over, arms and legs flailing in the mulch. And then something hilarious happened. His sandals flew right off his feet. I don't even know how it happened, but 1 second they were on him, and the next they were lying in the dirt beside me. Without thinking, I scooped them up and started walking away. He jumped back up immediately, screaming at the top of his lungs for me to give him back his shoes. He tried to run after me, but I kept the sandals just out of reach. He didn't dare throw a punch because he knew as well as I did that wouldn't end well for him. After a while, though, I started getting tired of it. His shrieking was almost as bad as his chanting. That's when I noticed we were under one of those open shelters with a concrete floor and a slanted roof overhead. I had an idea. Slowly, I backed out from under the roof, while holding the sandals in front of me, like I was about to hand them over. He hesitated for a second, then lunged forward, hoping to grab them. That's when I let go. The sandals soared through the air in a perfect arc. For a moment, everything felt frozen. Time slowed, the clouds broke, and sunlight streamed through like a spotlight. The shoes spun gracefully, rising higher and higher until finally gravity pulled them down. And with the most satisfying thud, they landed flat on top of the roof, far out of reach. The playground went silent. Then came the scream. MYSHOES! His cry echoed so loudly, I thought the whole neighborhood would hear. Meanwhile, I bolted, probably leaving a cartoon-style dust cloud behind me. I don't even remember that kid's name anymore, but the memory of his sandals stuck on that roof and the sound of his shrieking still makes me smile to this day. That story wraps up here. It's wild how the smallest moments from childhood can stick with you forever. Something as simple as tossing a pair of sandals became this legendary memory, frozen in time. The way kids find such dramatic meaning in little playground battles is almost hilarious when you look back on it. I think everyone has that one story from when they were young that still makes them grin years later. This next story is about a mean girl in class who thought she could get away with taking someone else's chair, only for it to backfire in front of everyone. Back in my first or second year of high school, I had computer studies as one of my classes. I was the kind of kid who stayed quiet, did my work, and tried to make life as easy as possible for the teacher. In that class, we always had to work in pairs. My assigned buddy was the so-called bad boy of the grade. He had a bit of a rebellious reputation, but he actually had a good heart and was way smarter than he let on. Naturally, half the girls in school seemed to have a crush on him, including one girl in particular. Let's call her Elle. Elle was the stereotypical mean girl type. She was loud, she always wore skirts that broke dress code, and she spent most of class time flirting instead of actually doing work. On top of that, she made it pretty clear she thought she was above other girls, especially anyone outside her little circle. I was one of the people she didn't like, so she'd usually throw shade at me whenever she could. Most days, Elle would show up late to class, like 10 minutes in, and the teacher barely batted an eye. On this particular day, she wandered in late again and immediately went to hang around a group of guys, laughing and leaning against their desks. The classroom was packed, and we were one chair short. Instead of grabbing a spare from the hallway, Elle just perched herself on top of one of the tables. When it was my buddy's turn to do the coding exercise, I stepped away from my seat to quickly ask the teacher if I could use the bathroom. I wasn't gone long, maybe just a couple of minutes. But when I came back, I noticed my chair was gone. Sure enough, Elle had swiped it and moved a few computers over to sit with the guys she'd been flirting with. I pointed out that she'd taken my chair, and she just smirked at me, tossed out a snarky comment, and rolled her eyes before turning her back. She didn't care at all. At that point, there wasn't much I could do, so I just stood there for a second, annoyed. But then, not even 30 seconds later, she stood up while still mid-conversation, half paying attention. She shoved the chair back without looking, like she was just making space, and left it there. That was all I needed. I walked over, grabbed it, and quickly sat back down in front of my computer, helping my buddy get through the assignment. It wasn't long after that when the moment came. Out of nowhere, Elle let out a startled yell. Everyone's heads turned at the same time. She had completely lost her balance and ended up on the ground, legs up in the air, looking more embarrassed than I'd ever seen her. The entire class burst into laughter. Even some of the guys who usually flirted with her couldn't help but laugh. A couple of them even leaned over and gave me high fives, like I'd somehow orchestrated the whole thing. Elle scrambled to her feet, red-faced and fuming. She immediately turned on me, trying to blame me for what had just happened. I didn't even raise my voice. I just told her calmly not to steal my chair again. And that was it. For once, she had to sit there with no comeback, just her pride bruised in front of everyone. That's the end of this story. There's something about high school moments like that that just stick with people. It's not even about revenge. It's just that little feeling of balance when someone who constantly acts untouchable finally gets humbled. You can almost picture the whole room freezing for a second before the laughter started. Honestly, little wins like that can end up feeling bigger than they really are. This next story is about a coworker prank that escalated way beyond the usual harmless jokes and turned into something unforgettable in the office. At one point in my career, I was assigned to train a new hire. She was a pretty attractive woman, and because of that, the two of us ended up sharing an office for about a month while she got up to speed. Things were going fine, but then there was another coworker of mine who started to get involved in his own way. This guy wasn't creepy in the threatening sense, but he was definitely a little skeezy. He liked to flirt with women in the office, though he usually did it in this low-key, almost awkward way. It wasn't aggressive, more like he just wanted some affirmation. The funny part was that he was married. People generally liked him, and I don't think he was trying to cross any real lines. He just enjoyed being around pretty women. The problem came when he decided that he and I were closer friends than we actually were. Out of nowhere, he started treating me like we had this back and forth prankster type of relationship. I didn't really feel that way about him, but he convinced himself that we were the kind of coworkers who pulled little jokes on each other. That gave him plenty of excuses to wander into my office when I wasn't there and chat with my office mate while he left behind small pranks for me. Most of his tricks weren't big deals. Stuff like putting a sticky note under my mouse so it wouldn't work when I got back. But I've never liked pranks. None of my real friends prank me, partly because I don't enjoy it, and partly because when I do respond, I don't always respond in a way that's proportional. I have a tendency to take things further, and this was one of those times. I decided to stay late one night and set up my retaliation. My coworker had this digital picture frame in his office that cycled through family photos, was always on, displaying pictures of his wife and kids. That frame was the perfect canvas. The first photo I worked on was one of his wife wearing a Texas Longhorns cowboy hat. I took that hat and turned it into something wildly inappropriate. A photoshopped cowboy hat shaped like male anatomy. Then I moved on to a picture of his eldest daughter, who was maybe around 5 years old. She looked totally normal in the original photo, but I gave her a lazy eye. Subtle, but definitely noticeable. Next was a picture of his younger daughter, who was maybe 2 or 3 at the time. She'd been eating chocolate messily, and she had this little mischievous smile while looking upward. In the blurry background, there happened to be this big pink rhododendron flower out of focus. For some reason, it gave me the idea to Photoshop Hitler into the flower, so it looked like she was happily taking advice from him. Twisted, yes, but it was part of the joke. Finally, there was another photo of his wife in profile. On that one, I lowered the opacity of a grinning picture of myself and blended it right onto her cheek, so my face was faintly visible as if I was just lurking there. Once I had the edits finished, I loaded the pictures onto his digital frame, but I didn't keep it to myself. I told my entire team, and word spread to people on his team too. Everyone knew what I had done, and we all quietly waited for him to notice. Every time we passed by his office, we'd glance at that frame, just waiting for the moment. And the wildest part? It took him 3 weeks to finally notice. 3 whole weeks of those edited pictures cycling through in his office. By the time he realized, it had become a running joke across both teams. When he did figure it out, he actually sent out a company-wide message giving props to whoever pulled it off. HR got involved in the most half-hearted way possible, asking a couple of questions but clearly not taking it seriously. And the best part was that he never ratted me out, even though everyone already knew I was behind it. Looking back, it turned into one of the funniest memories I have from that job. That's where the story ends. Office pranks can be hit or miss, but this one went way past the usual little sticky note tricks. The amount of patience it took for everyone to wait 3 weeks just to see him notice probably made it even better. It's kind of wild how something small can snowball into a story that the whole workplace ends up being in on. Stuff like that really shows how much of an impact timing and commitment have in making a joke land. This next story is about a bad roommate situation where a couple tried to pressure their housemate into paying thousands for furniture he never agreed to. About 10 years ago, I was living with my uncle, but I really wanted to move out and prove to myself that I could handle things on my own. Around that same time, my girlfriend's best friend and her boyfriend were also looking to move out. They wanted to live together. So the 3 of us sat down one day over coffee and worked out a budget plan. It seemed doable, so we agreed to give it a shot. My girlfriend wasn't ready to leave home yet, so it ended up just being me, the best friend, and her boyfriend splitting the rent and bills. My uncle warned me before I moved in. He told me flat out, living with a couple is never easy, because in arguments, it'll always feel like 2 against 1. He said it wouldn't be pretty. I heard him, but I wanted to try it anyway. About 2 months later, we found an apartment that fit our budget. I paid my share of rent and the damage deposit, and we moved in. At first, things seemed fine. After about 3 weeks, we started talking about getting new furniture, kitchen stuff, and all the basics. Since I was working long shifts and commuting, I told them they could pick everything out as long as it stayed within the budget we agreed on. I'd gladly pay my portion. They seemed fine with that, so they went out to IKEA and said they'd grab what we needed. Later, they handed me a contract with a total amount but no receipts attached. They told me I needed to sign it and pay up. I asked them to show me proof of purchase, and they said I should just trust them. When I asked how much my portion was, they told me an extra $3,500, on top of what I had already paid. I told them I'd talk about it after work, and the boyfriend said fine, but the girlfriend got all huffy. That Monday, I pulled a 12-hour shift and drove an hour and a half home, only to find that my key didn't work. At first I thought maybe something was wrong with the lock, but when my landlord showed up, his master key wouldn't open it either. That's when we heard someone inside yell that if we didn't leave, she'd call the cops. My landlord was furious. He'd personally watched all three of us sign the lease, and from his perspective, we'd seemed to get along. But she refused to even come to the door and talk. We stood outside arguing through the door for a good 30 minutes before she finally called the police. When the cops arrived, my landlord gave them permission to use force to get me into my own space. They opened the door, told me to stay in my room unless necessary, and said it would be best for me to move out soon. My landlord even offered me a one-bedroom apartment once things settled, so I wouldn't break my lease with him. The cops told my roommates to grow up and to stay in their room until we could talk like adults. I just went to bed. The next morning, I finally saw the furniture I was supposedly on the hook for. It wasn't IKEA at all. They'd gone to higher-end places and picked out all white leather couches, marble side tables, and expensive name-brand pieces, stuff I would never have agreed to buy. I told them they could keep the portion I'd already given them, but I wasn't paying another dime. It was way beyond our budget, and I knew I'd never see any of it once I moved out. Things only got worse after that. I'd come home to find all my food thrown out. My coffee mugs were smashed. They even took the shower curtain, all the towels, and the toilet paper into their room. These were all things I'd bought long before the furniture mess. The only things they left behind were their toothbrushes. After coming home from a 10 or 12-hour shift, that kind of petty sabotage was exhausting. A week later, the couple broke up. The boyfriend tried to make amends with me, mostly because all those big purchases were sitting on his credit card. By then, though, I was already preparing to move into my own place, and I told him I just couldn't help. I was too strapped for cash from replacing everything they had broken. By the end of that week, I was gone for good. That story ends there. Roommate horror stories really hit different when there's a couple involved. It's wild how quickly things can go from bad budgeting to completely locking someone out of their own home. You can almost feel the tension of coming home after a long shift and realizing the locks won't even turn. It makes you appreciate when you finally get a place that's actually your own, even if it's small. This next story is about a sibling meltdown that turned into a prank and a separate school lunch stunt that got unexpected results. When I was in high school, my sister had this habit of complaining about pretty much everything. No matter what the situation was, she could find a way to turn it into a problem. One afternoon, she decided she wanted to go to the store, but she didn't want to drive and definitely didn't want to walk. The problem was, I had a research paper due that I had already been putting off for way too long. I was finally making progress and told her I couldn't take her. That, of course, set her off into a tantrum. The yelling got so bad that my mom stepped in and told me to just take her to the store to keep the peace. So I gave in, grabbed my keys, and we headed to the car. As soon as I started it, I noticed the gas light was on. I mentioned it to her, hoping she'd maybe realize how inconvenient this was. But she just snapped, "I don't care, I'm not walking." So I drove her anyway, even though I knew this trip would drain what little gas I had left. The entire ride there, she kept complaining. About me, about the car, about whatever came to mind. We got to the store, she grabbed her things, and we headed back. On the drive home, she was still in a bad mood, being rude just for the sake of it. I already knew she wasn't about to thank me, let alone offer gas money. That's when something interesting happened. By accident, I slipped the car into neutral for a second. Since I drove a stick shift and she didn't know how it worked, she immediately assumed I had run out of gas. That's when I got an idea. I went along with it. I said, "Yep, looks like we're out. We'll have to coast and see how far we get." We were only about a block away from home, so it was the perfect setup. I started gently pressing the brakes now and then to make it feel like the car was struggling. I told her, "You're going to have to push while I steer." She rolled her eyes and asked why she couldn't steer while I pushed. I told her I'd be pushing too, but it made more sense for me to stay by the driver's seat so I wouldn't mess anything up. She wasn't happy, but she got out and started pushing. Meanwhile, I was just holding the wheel with one hand on the open driver's door, pretending to push. At one point, I even swerved a little like the car was getting out of line and said I needed to hop in so I wouldn't mess it up. She glared at me, but she kept pushing. Finally, when we were about 20 feet from the driveway, I yelled out, "We made it!" Then I casually turned the key, started the car back up, and pulled right in like nothing happened. She burst into tears, ran inside, and I stood there thinking my mom was going to tear into me for pulling that prank. That wasn't the only stunt I pulled in high school, though. Our cafeteria food was bland at the best of times, and the worst day of all was sausage day. They'd plop down 2 dry sausage links on your tray. No bread, no dip, no sauce, nothing. Just plain sausages. I hated it. One day, I happened to have a tube of nail glue with me, and I got an idea. Before dumping my tray, I superglued the sausages right to it. I put it on the return line like normal and stood back to watch. The lunch lady came over, tried to spray the tray down, and those sausages wouldn't budge. She kept trying, and I was laughing so hard I could barely keep it in. Word must have spread after that because from then on, they started serving the sausages with barbecue sauce. I did end up having to pay for the tray I ruined, but honestly, that felt like a fair trade. That's where this story finishes. That's such a sibling move, pretending to run out of gas just to get some petty payback. Honestly, I don't blame them though, because sometimes a little prank is the only way to balance things out. And the sausage thing, that's hilarious because it's one of those small acts of rebellion that actually change something. I think everyone's got at least one story like that from school where they didn't mean to make a big difference, but somehow they did. This next story is about a manipulative family member who thrived on stirring up drama until someone finally turned the tables and exposed her games. In my family, there was one person who seemed to thrive on chaos. She had this habit of setting people against each other and then pretending she was just an innocent bystander. If anyone called her out, she'd brush it off with lines like, "I didn't really mean it like that," or "You guys take things too seriously," or even, "I was just repeating what I heard." It was her signature move, and for a long time, it worked. Her tactic was always the same. She'd wait until she had someone alone, then feed them lies about what others supposedly said. At the same time, she'd fish for personal information she could use later. Then she'd carry those twisted stories back to the other side, always making sure to take the winner's position so she could keep the drama alive while dodging blame herself. Eventually, she set her sights on me. But unlike some others in the family, I had grown up with my fair share of manipulation. Thanks to years of dealing with my mom and others who thrived on the same kind of toxic behavior, I was prepared. At first, I stayed quiet, just watching her pattern. I knew people didn't like me much to begin with, so her little lies landed harder against me than most. But staying quiet gave me the chance to really study how she operated. After a while, I decided I wasn't going to let her get away with it anymore. So I started showing up where she least expected it. I'd hide in closets, bathrooms, laundry rooms, anywhere I could stay out of sight but close enough to hear what she was saying. I listened to her spinning stories about me, telling people she saw me places I never went, or swearing she had proof of things I never did. She'd claim she saw videos of me online with people I didn't even know, or hint that I was sneaking around behind everyone's backs. Sometimes she'd even throw in digs about me ending up with a child out of wedlock, which she knew would hit hard with my religious parents. And then, after she'd finished one of her little performances, I'd casually walk in a few moments later, calm, composed, and very much not where she claimed I had been. I wouldn't even have to say anything most of the time. Just showing up contradicted everything she had said. It didn't take long before it became almost a running joke. Other relatives started to notice, and instead of me being the target, it was her who looked foolish. One of my favorite moments was when she loudly told everyone I had been out at a club surrounded by guys, supposedly dressed in a way that would horrify the family. And right after she said it, I stepped into the room wearing modest, religiously approved clothing, fresh from saying a prayer. I even threw in a few post-prayer words under my breath, just for effect. The look on her face was priceless, and another relative of mine who also couldn't stand her found the whole thing hilarious. For a while, I actually gained support in the family because of how obvious her lies were becoming. I turned her own tactics against her, and she never realized I was the one making her look ridiculous. Eventually, she got tired of failing with me and moved on to another target, which meant things went back to normal for me. But I'll admit, watching her squirm in those moments was worth every second. That story wraps up here. That's one of those rare times where someone beat a manipulator at their own game. It's satisfying because usually people like that get away with their little tricks for way too long. The way they flipped it by showing up right after the lies were told. Man, that's sharp. It's almost like letting the truth do the work for you. And you can picture how awkward the silence must have been every time she got caught like that. This next story is about a nightmare boss, endless petty write-ups, and one final act of revenge that left the office reeking. Back in my early 20s, I had what might have been the worst job I've ever held. I worked the counter at a store, basically processing sales for the floor staff who earned commission. My job should have been straightforward, but management constantly dumped the most pointless and miserable tasks on me. Whenever there was a sale, I was forced to spend hours blowing up dozens of balloons. They weren't just balloons either. They were coated with this sticky, gooey mess inside that made them reek. And the whole time, I was on edge, because I've always had this fear of balloons popping. Imagine sitting there, hours on end, waiting for that sudden loud bang that makes you jump out of your skin. That was my extra duty. The boss at that store was just as bad as the work. She had this habit of leaving critical notes for me and the other women who worked the counter. Every single day, there'd be some passive-aggressive comment scribbled down for us. She also pulled every trick she could to underpay me. I wasn't paid for breaks. She'd dock me if I was even 5 minutes late. And yet I was commuting 3 hours round trip for shifts that only lasted 4 hours. And then at closing time, it took at least half an hour to get everything done. But she wouldn't pay for that time either. At one point, she even told me I could transfer to a store closer to my house, but that turned out to be a lie. By the time I'd been there 2 years, I was basically a veteran. That's saying something, because during that same year, 9 different counter staff cycled through. Meanwhile, the sister store, same company, different boss, kept the exact same 3 counter staff for 3 years straight. That contrast told me everything I needed to know. The only person who'd been there longer than me was a middle-aged woman named Karen. At first I thought she was decent. She was polite to my face, but later I learned she'd been talking about me behind my back. I found out she even told the boss I was violating the dress code, which confused me, because Karen came to work every single day wearing the same dirty Birkenstocks, and nobody said a word about it. So as a bit of a protest, I decided to wear the exact same outfit to work every single day. Dress pants, a neat Argyle sweater, and a pair of black heels. Month after month, I stuck to it, and eventually, I got written up again. That was the last straw. I marched straight into the boss's office and asked her what her issue was with my outfit. She looked me over and said, "Well, that one's fine." That's when I snapped back, "I've been wearing this exact outfit for 5 months." She had no response, just silence. That's when I knew I was done. I'd already lined up a manager from another branch, someone who couldn't stand my boss but liked me, to give me a solid reference. On top of that, I wrote a 2-page letter to my boss, detailing all the awful ways she treated staff, and even gave her suggestions on how she might retain people in the future. Not that I expected her to actually listen, but I didn't stop there. I wanted to leave on a note that she'd never forget. So I dug into the darkest, most neglected corner of my parents' fridge and found this horrifying jar of garlic dipping sauce. The thing was bulging at the sides, and when I opened it, it smelled like something had died inside. I packed it into a Ziploc bag, grabbed some gloves, and brought it with me on my final shift. Just before closing up for the last time, I went through the office and smeared that rotten, festering goo all over the doorknobs belonging to everyone who had made my life miserable. By the time I left, the entire office reeked. The smell was thick and foul, and I couldn't stop grinning on my way out. The thought of my boss walking in the next morning, grabbing that handle, and carrying that stench around with her was the most satisfying send-off I could have asked for. Never in my life have I been happier to quit a job. That's the end of this story. There's something almost cinematic about quitting a bad job with one final act of pettiness. Like the balloons, the notes, the lies, all of that built up to that one disgusting jar of garlic sauce. Honestly, the fact she stuck it out for 2 whole years says a lot about patience and endurance. Most people wouldn't have lasted half as long, and I think hearing about that slow buildup makes the ending hit even harder. It's like watching someone finally break free and slam the door shut behind them. This next story is about a mechanic who kept dodging responsibility and how one customer turned the tables using the exact same excuse he'd been fed for months. About 20 years ago, I owned an old '68 Dodge Monaco convertible that needed a motor job. My plan was to do it myself, but my dad told me about a guy he used to work for. Apparently, this guy had just bought a motor shop and promised my dad he'd give us a deal if we ever needed work done. It seemed like good timing, so I decided to go through him instead of wrenching on it alone. I got a quote for the job, and it looked reasonable enough. I dropped off the motor, waited for the call that it was ready, then went and picked it up. I put it back into the car, expecting everything to run smooth. But right away, I could tell something was off. The motor wasn't right. It wasn't just a minor tweak. It needed to be taken apart again. I called the shop and explained what was going on. The guy told me they were busy and that he'd give me a call next week. At first, I believed him. 1 week went by, then another. Every time I called, I got the same line. We're busy. Next week. This dragged on for months. No progress, no real answers. Just an endless cycle of next weeks. Then one day, I heard the shop had gone bankrupt. That explained a lot. When I talked to the owner about it, he said he'd give me the parts I needed so I could fix the motor myself. Fine, I figured. At least that way I could get the car back on the road. On the day I was supposed to pick up the parts, I drove over to the shop. But instead of handing me what I came for, I found out they were holding a massive sale to clear out all their tools and equipment. I noticed a heavy-duty industrial drill press sitting there, complete with a full set of bits. I asked what he wanted for it, got a price, and then told him I didn't have the cash on me, but I promised him I'd pay when I picked up my motor parts. He agreed, and we loaded the press and the bits into my truck. A couple of weeks later, I finally got the call that my parts were in. His wife happened to be driving near my area, so the plan was for me to meet her, get the parts, and pay her. She showed up with the parts, handed them over, and asked for the money. I kept my tone polite and told her I wanted to check the parts first, and that I'd pay her husband later. Not long after, the phone rang. It was the owner, looking for his money. I told him I'd check the parts and call him next week, and that became the routine. Every week, he'd call, and every week I'd say, next week. After a while, he gave up. Months later, he ran into my dad at a coffee shop and tried to spin the story like I had scammed him. My dad wasn't having it. He laid into him, pointing out that the way he ran that business was exactly why a motor shop that had lasted 20 years under the old owner closed down within 1 year of him buying it. That's where the story ends. It's kind of wild how the same excuse he used, next week, ended up being thrown right back at him. There's something satisfying about that kind of symmetry. What really stands out is how the shop went under so fast after changing hands. You don't wreck a place with 20 years of history unless you're doing a lot wrong. And honestly, the patience it took to keep giving him his own line week after week makes the ending even sharper. This next story is about a nightmare flatmate who stole, lied, and mooched off everything until some petty revenge finally made things a little more bearable. Back in the 90s, I had a flatmate from hell. She ran up my phone bill by hundreds of dollars, even though she always claimed she didn't have money to chip in. On top of that, she constantly took my stuff, my clothes, my stereo, even my CDs, and kept them in her room like they belonged to her. The only way I ever got anything back was if I straight up asked for it. To make things worse, she had zero respect for boundaries. I'll never forget the time she wore my white bodysuit, the kind with the G-string bottom that was popular back then. Not only was it several sizes too small for her, but she also left a stain in it that made it unwearable. That was the level of selfishness I was dealing with every day. And the food? Forget it. She ate all of mine. I worked full-time, came home exhausted, and found empty cupboards. Meanwhile, she never worked, sat around all day, and only bought food for herself, which she didn't share. I ended up living on takeout just so I wouldn't starve. The kicker? She even used my toothbrush, thinking I wouldn't notice. After putting up with this nonsense for months, I hit my breaking point. But before officially kicking her out, I decided to enjoy a little pettiness. The first move was simple, but effective. I worked in a daycare, and catching stomach bugs was pretty much part of the job. Around that time, a nasty gastrobug was going around, and of course I caught it. Instead of keeping my germs to myself, I brushed my teeth with my usual toothbrush, then put it right back where she'd use it too. I didn't say a word, just kept brushing my teeth like normal. Sure enough, a day or so later, she was glued to the bathroom, violently sick. When she complained, I casually mentioned that a stomach bug was going around and that I'd had it too, so she must have picked it up from me. She looked miserable, and after that, she finally bought her own toothbrush. That alone felt like a win, but I wasn't finished. I knew she hated spicy food, so I picked up some lamb cutlets and made the hottest chili marinade I could come up with. I soaked those cutlets for hours, cooked them all, and made sure to pour the leftover marinade straight into the pan for good measure. When she came home, I sat there eating them with a knife and fork, enjoying every bite. I left plenty of leftovers in the fridge without mentioning the spice. Predictably, she went straight for them later. Not long after, she came stumbling in, trying to figure out how to wash chili out of her eyes. She'd eaten some, didn't like it, wiped her hands on her face, and ended up in even more pain. Watching her try to recover from that was one of the only satisfying moments of living with her. That story wraps up here. There's something about petty revenge that just hits different when you're living with someone unbearable. Like, it doesn't fix the bigger problem, but it gives you a little sanity back. You can tell the roommate thought she could just walk all over everything and get away with it, but those moments of karma made things way more tolerable. Honestly, anyone who's ever had a bad roommate probably felt a little secondhand relief hearing this. This next story is about a terrible boss who scammed customers, mistreated employees, and fired a pregnant coworker until one of his workers decided to hit back. When I was 17, I thought I'd finally lucked into a decent job. I had been working at McDonald's for almost 2 years, stuck on minimum wage and dealing with all the usual fast food chaos, when one of the regulars, a woman who always ordered a large Diet Coke, started chatting with me in the mornings. She mentioned she worked for a shipping franchise and said they were always short-staffed. She told me I should apply because I'd get better pay and better hours. At the time, I was desperate to get out of McDonald's, so I jumped on it. I should have seen the red flags right away. My interview lasted maybe 5 minutes. The boss, who I'll call Jeff, barely looked at my application. He didn't ask about my experience or my goals. He didn't even tell me what position I was being hired for. It was basically, "Can you start next week?" And me, being 17 and not knowing any better, said yes. At first the work seemed fine. I was packing boxes, sorting mail, taking down customer info, and learning how shipments got logged. It wasn't glamorous, but after flipping burgers for so long, it felt like a step up. That first month, I was actually enjoying it. The coworkers were decent, the tasks were straightforward, and I thought maybe I had found something solid. But then I had my 1-month review. Jeff sat me down and told me I was a valuable asset. His reasoning wasn't exactly flattering. I was just young, strong, and didn't slack off. That was it. But along with the compliment came a catch. He wanted me to start splitting shifts between his 2 stores. The one I had applied to was a mile from my house. I could walk there if I didn't have a ride. The other was 30 miles away, which meant long commutes, gas money I didn't have, and hours on the road I wasn't paid for. Still, I thought maybe that's just what jobs were like, so I went along with it. The more I worked, the more I realized Jeff was a sleazy guy. Physically, he looked like a cartoon version of a bad boss. Always with his shirt unbuttoned too far, chest hair on display, and this smug grin on his face. He bragged about cheating on his wife to anyone who would listen, and he carried himself like he was untouchable. On the business side, he had all these shady little scams going. Customers who needed a bit of extra tape to seal their packages, he charged them a whole $1, even though we bought rolls in bulk for that same price. He had special software installed that automatically added about 10% to every shipment price. He'd push us to sell the fastest, most expensive shipping options, and would actually raise his voice at customers who asked for cheaper choices. It was embarrassing watching people walk out furious because of him. Meanwhile, my hours started climbing. Suddenly, I was working 40 or more hours every week. But Jeff had a trick for that too. Since I technically worked at 2 different stores under 2 separate company names, I never got overtime pay. I was racking up full-time hours, doing way more than I was hired for, and still barely making over minimum wage. By month 4, I was basically a manager without the title. I was opening and closing the store, counting cash drawers, ordering supplies, even training new people. Any normal job would have given me a raise, or at least some recognition. But when I asked about it, Jeff flat out told me I was just doing my job. Then came the thing that really disgusted me. We had a contract with a big telecom company. Let's call it Hey T&T. Customers would drop off old cable boxes, remotes, and wires, and we'd scan them and ship them back. The telecom company covered the shipping, so the store made money on every return. That should have been enough, but Jeff couldn't help himself. Anything without a barcode, extra wires, adapters, batteries, he took. He'd strip the copper out or sell it on eBay and he made us package it up for him. He probably pulled in thousands every month just from that. None of it went to the employees. The breaking point came in one brutal week. One of my favorite coworkers had recently gotten pregnant. She was holding everything together, working hard and planning to bring the baby in sometimes when things were slow. Then, during a late night staff meeting, Jeff actually congratulated her on working hard despite her disability. Right after saying that, in front of all 15 of us, he fired her. Just like that. His excuse was that the holiday season was coming and she'd slow things down. Watching her walk out like that lit a fire under me. As if that wasn't bad enough, Jeff turned around and started handing out assignments for the corporate review we had coming up. When he got to me, he said my job was to drive supplies, cash for the registers, and even our only working fire extinguisher back and forth between the stores to make them look up to standard. That was when I knew I couldn't just sit back anymore. I made some calls. First to AT&T's fraud department. I explained everything, sent them photos, and they set up a visit. Then I called Not FedEx Corporate and told them what was happening. They promised to send a rep too. I timed it so both groups would show up at the same time as corporate's big inspection. On the day of the inspection, Jeff expected me to quietly shuffle everything around like his little errand boy. Instead, I left supplies at the wrong store, then moved them right after the inspectors left. It threw his whole plan into chaos. Meanwhile, the reps showed up and got an eyeful of what he'd been doing. From what I heard later, there was shouting in his office, threats about his franchise, and a whole lot of damage control. He ended up losing the AT&T contract, got fined for not having proper equipment, and was forced to use corporate's pricing instead of his inflated ones. He still runs the stores today, but both have terrible reputations, 2-star reviews, customers complaining, and nowhere near the grip on things he once had. Knowing I played a part in taking him down a peg is something I'll never forget. That's the end of this story. It's wild how much shady stuff gets swept under the rug at small businesses until someone finally says enough. This one stood out because the storyteller was just a teenager dealing with stuff most adults wouldn't even put up with. And honestly, it makes you think about how many people have stories of their first jobs being way rougher than they should have been. Even if the boss didn't lose everything, hearing that he got knocked down a few steps makes the whole thing feel a little more satisfying. This next story is about a family on a packed international flight who tried to trick someone out of their seat, turning a simple trip into a ridiculous standoff in the aisle. I still shake my head when I think back on this one. A couple of years ago, I was on a long international flight, the kind that's already exhausting before it even begins. You know the drill, standing in those endless lines at the gate, dragging your bags through security, and finally boarding with 100 other tired, impatient people. This flight was fully booked. Not a single seat left open. It was going to be 8 hours in the air, and all I wanted was to sink into my spot and zone out until we landed. This was one of those big planes with 3 rows of seats, 3 on each side by the windows, and a row of 4 right down the middle. My seat was on the side. Economy class, aisle seat, just the way I like it. Easy to get up, easy to stretch my legs, and best of all, not trapped in the middle. I had settled in, stuffed my bag under the seat, buckled in, and was just trying to get comfortable for the long haul. A couple came down the aisle with their toddler already fussing in their arms. The mom slid right into the middle section of seats next to me, with the kid on her lap. The dad, though, didn't sit down. Instead, he gave me this hopeful look, leaned over, and asked if I could switch seats with him so he could sit with his family. Now, normally, I don't mind helping people out, but I've been burned on seat swaps before, so I asked him what seat he had. That's when he said he had a business class ticket. I was shocked for a second. Business class on an 8-hour flight sounded like heaven compared to the cramped row I was in. So I said sure, no problem. I'd gladly trade. I started getting up, reaching for my bag, already thinking about stretching out in a wide seat with a little more legroom. But just as I stood up, he quickly backtracked. Suddenly, he said, "Actually, my wife wanted to sit up there. Could you take her spot in the middle row instead?" I froze. That meant I'd be trading my aisle seat for the very worst possible seat. The middle of the middle section, trapped on both sides, and right next to a screaming toddler. I looked at him and said flatly, "No, I'm not switching to a middle seat in the middle row. You told me you wanted to sit with your family." That's when his whole tone changed. He started getting defensive, his voice louder, holding up the line of passengers behind us. People were already sighing and shifting in place because the aisle was blocked. He insisted that it wasn't fair for his wife to miss out on the better seat since she had planned to use it. He went on about how I'd agreed to switch, and now I wasn't keeping my word. By this point, my patience was running thin. I snapped back at him. Not my proudest moment, but I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I even made a sarcastic comment about whether he had extra of whatever he was on, because it had to be some strong stuff to act this delusional in public. The whole scene dragged out until finally, a flight attendant pushed her way up the aisle. She was clearly annoyed, asking why we weren't in our seats yet. Before I could even open my mouth, this guy had the audacity to claim that I had offered to take his wife's seat and was now refusing. He completely twisted the situation around to make himself look like the victim. I wasn't even surprised at that point. It felt like the kind of bold lie someone like him would try to get away with. But luckily, the passengers sitting behind me had seen and heard everything. They backed me up right away. The flight attendant, already fed up, wasn't in the mood to play games. She took one look at his ticket, then turned to me and said, "Grab your bag." I followed her to the front of the plane, and just like that, I was seated in business class where he was supposed to be. Spacious seat, better service, a much calmer environment. Meanwhile, I could only imagine him sulking back in economy, stuck in that middle row with his fussy toddler and annoyed wife. Let's just say I had a very nice flight after that. That's the end of this story. There's just something funny about how people can dig themselves into a hole that deep with pure entitlement. Like, if he had just been honest, he'd still have his business class seat. Instead, he got stuck in the worst spot and handed it over to someone else. The timing of the passenger behind stepping in made it even better. That kind of backup feels rare on a flight. Honestly, I think anyone listening would have taken the upgrade too. This next story is about someone cutting the line at a busy restaurant, only to get called out in front of everyone waiting. A couple of years back, my family and I went out to eat at Red Robin. It was one of those mornings where the place was just opening, and already there was a crowd forming outside. By the time we arrived, there were maybe 30 people in line. It wasn't shoulder to shoulder packed, but definitely busy enough that everyone was trying to hold their spot and wait their turn. We had been standing there for a good 15 minutes, chatting, shifting from one foot to the other, and just waiting for the host to unlock the doors and start seating people. Finally, the host appeared, clipboard in hand, ready to start checking people in. That's when this older woman walked straight up from nowhere and breezed past the entire line like none of us existed. She didn't even hesitate, just strolled right up to the host stand as if she had been there all along. I couldn't believe it. Everyone else looked around, but nobody said a word at first. That's when I stepped in. I leaned forward and interrupted before the host could finish with her. I told the host loud enough for people nearby to hear, "This lady just cut in front of the entire line." Then I turned to the woman and asked how she managed to get ahead of us when we'd been waiting 15 minutes. She tried to play it off like she didn't know what I was talking about, giving that wide-eyed, "Oh what, me?" kind of act. But you could see the frustration on her face now, that the whole line's eyes were on her. The room had gone quiet for a moment, and she wasn't expecting anyone to actually call her out. I stood my ground and told the host that my family should be seated first. After all, we had been waiting patiently like everyone else. Once we were taken care of, I said they could deal with the line cutter however they wanted. The host seemed relieved that someone spoke up, and they went ahead and seated us right away. When we finally got our table and ordered, I noticed something ironic. The woman ended up being seated right next to us. And not only that, but her table was positioned so that we were facing each other directly. So the whole time she had no choice but to look up occasionally and see me staring at her from across the table. I didn't say a word. I just sat there eating, keeping my eyes on her every so often, letting the silence do the talking. You could tell it was making her uncomfortable because she fidgeted, looked down at her phone, and kept glancing away. After a while, she actually picked up her phone and called someone, trying to figure out where the rest of her group was. That's when I overheard the funniest part of all of this. She had messed up the time because of daylight savings and was actually an hour early. That meant she hadn't even needed to rush to the front in the first place. When that sunk in, I couldn't help but smirk. The whole situation just spoke for itself. She caught me grinning at her, clearly embarrassed, and not long after, she asked the staff to move her to another table. Maybe she gets away with that kind of thing most of the time, banking on people not saying anything because she's older. But not that day. That's where the story ends. There's something oddly satisfying about seeing someone try to bend the rules and then get stuck in their own mess. It's It's funny how all it took was a little pushback to make her whole plan fall apart. The twist about her being an hour early made it even better, like the universe just adding a punchline on top of the whole thing. Honestly, I think anyone who's had to wait in a long line can appreciate watching a line cutter get checked. This next story is about tenants who dealt with a shady landlord that ignored them for months, until they decided to turn his own silence back on him. Finding a place to live where I am is already hard enough, so when my roommate and I finally secured an apartment through an acquaintance, we felt like we'd caught a break. The rent was higher than what we could comfortably afford, but since it included utilities and internet, we convinced ourselves it would balance out. It felt like such a relief at the time that we brushed off the red flags staring us in the face. It didn't take long before those red flags became reality. The first issue hit when the electricity was suddenly cut off, not because of anything we did, but because our landlord hadn't paid the bill. We ended up spending 5 full days without power. That meant no lights, no heating, no working outlets, and worst of all, losing everything in the fridge. By law, we weren't even required to pay rent for those days. But when we pointed this out, our landlord flat out refused to reimburse us. Taking him to court would have cost more than just eating the loss, so we let it go. Then it happened again. This time it was the heating, and of course it happened in November, when the temperatures had already dropped. It was brutal. After that, the internet started cutting out every other month. Eventually, we just started paying the internet provider directly, because we couldn't risk having it shut off randomly anymore. Through all of this, we were never late on rent, not once. We held up our side of the agreement every single month. The problem was entirely our landlord. He was collecting the rent, but clearly wasn't passing it on to pay the bills. The final straw came out of nowhere. One morning, the police showed up at our apartment with a search warrant in his name. They went through the entire place without hesitation, even barging in while I was in the shower. Standing there, dripping wet with police combing through the apartment, I knew then and there it was over. We had to leave. Truthfully, we'd already decided long before that we wanted out, but finding a new place in this market wasn't easy. This just sealed it. We did everything by the book. We gave notice, we sent him a text with our departure date, requested a walkthrough, and asked about exchanging the keys and deposit. We even mailed a formal letter to his legally registered address. And to explain how ridiculous this was, his registered address was actually the same apartment we were living in. In that letter, we included documentation of all the utility cuts and the police search as grounds for breaking the contract. And still, nothing. No response to the text. No acknowledgement of the letter. No call. He completely ghosted us. By that point, we had already accepted that we'd never see our deposit again. The guy was clearly terrible with money, and there was no chance he'd hand it back. So when the time came, we packed up our stuff and left. No petty tricks like rotting food in the fridge or shrimp hidden in the lamps. We just didn't bother to clean up, but that's where the petty revenge comes in. After months of being ignored, after sitting through power cuts, heat cuts, internet outages, and even the chaos of a police search, we simply walked away. And now, he's the one desperately trying to reach us. Out of nowhere, our phone started blowing up with messages. Text after text, every single day, pleading with us to tell him if we were going to pay rent, begging us to scan his important mail that was still being delivered to the old address, trying everything to get us to answer. But the thing is, if ghosting was his game, then we were more than happy to play it too. That story wraps up here. There's something about this one that feels so full circle. The landlord spent months ignoring them when they needed answers, and now he's the one panicking, left completely in the dark. Honestly, it's almost too perfect that his own silence came back to bite him. I think anyone who's dealt with a bad landlord can appreciate how satisfying it must have been to finally just walk away and leave him stuck with the mess he created. This next story is about a pretentious new manager who demanded respect by his job title, only to get stuck with a nickname that followed him everywhere. Back in one of my earlier jobs, we ended up with a manager who really thought he was hot stuff. He hadn't actually done the work he was supposed to be managing, but somehow he'd smarmed his way into a leadership role. From the very start, it was clear he was going to be a problem. He loved to remind us that he was in the management, while we were just the skilled team working under him. When our previous leader retired, this guy stepped into the role. But he didn't just want to be called a manager or a leader. No, he wanted to be addressed by his full job title, production leader. He would even correct us if we called him the gaffer or the boss. Nope, it had to be the production leader. Please respect his position, thanks. This insistence made him sound pretentious, especially since he didn't really understand the job. Anytime someone tried explaining the actual work to him, things like why a machine couldn't run until a certain step was completed, his eyes would glaze over. You could practically see him drifting off into a world of key performance indicators and spreadsheets, while ignoring the practical side of what we did. What made it worse was the way he talked about us. The old boss always said, "our team," like we were all in it together. This new guy? He called us "my team," as if we were his personal staff. That small change said a lot. Naturally, people didn't warm up to him. So, the crew decided to lean into a bit of malicious compliance. If he wanted to be called by his full title, Production Leader Operations, then we'd follow that to the letter. And of course, we abbreviated everything. Production Leader Operations became PL Ops, which, if you said it quickly, turned into PLOPS. The nickname caught on almost immediately. Within a day and a half, every shift was referring to him as Plops. The first time someone slipped and called him that to his face, you could see the color rush into his cheeks. He tried to correct it, insisting he was the production leader, but by then it was too late. Plops had stuck. He hated it, which only made it funnier. Picture him walking across the factory floor in his most serious voice, telling us he was the production leader, and then one of the guys casually responding with, "Sure thing, Plops." He'd turn bright red while everyone else struggled not to laugh. One time, 3 of the shop floor guys were standing around trying to figure out how to split a job with limited tools. Plops wandered over and asked why they weren't on their machines. One of the guys just said, "What's up, Plops?" The others followed his lead, explaining the problem and calling him Plops every chance they got. They laid out the math, showed him why his suggestion wouldn't work, and then sarcastically thanked him for his advice. He had no real response, and walked away looking defeated, while the guys laughed loud enough for him to hear. He complained to upper management constantly, expecting them to shut down the nickname, but even the higher-ups weren't on his side. His boss gave us a half-hearted lecture, but later we found out he disliked Plops too. He basically told him to stop whining because this wasn't school, and nicknames die out if you don't feed them. But of course, Plops kept bringing it up, which only made things worse for him. The best moment came during a site-wide meeting. Plops was running late, and when he finally walked in, a couple of voices called out, "What time do you call this, Plops?" And, "It must be Plops o'clock." The director of operations, who was leading the meeting, paused and said, "Not a problem, Plops." That was it. The whole room erupted in laughter. The director genuinely thought that was his name. When someone clarified that his name was John, the director apologized, but the damage was already done. Plops sat there looking humiliated and didn't say another word. A few days later, he announced he was transferring to another site for a similar role. No one was sad to see him go. Normally when someone leaves, they bring in cakes or snacks, but he didn't bother. So one of the guys made a phone call to a friend at the new facility, making sure the nickname followed him there. Sure enough, during his first introduction at the new site, he gave a polished little speech about keeping the wheels turning, and the room greeted him with a chorus of, "Well said, Plops." Back at our factory, we eventually got a new production leader. This one was actually decent. On his first day, he introduced himself, brought homemade samosas, and asked us to drop by his office for quick one-on-one chats. When I went to knock on his door, I noticed the sign he'd hung up. It read, "Plop's office." A perfect inside joke to show he understood the culture and wasn't taking himself too seriously. That's where the story ends. Nicknames really do have a life of their own, especially when they hit that perfect mix of funny and fitting. The fact that it stuck so hard that even a director used it shows just how little respect this guy earned. And honestly, the way it followed him to his next job is hilarious. Like, the universe making sure he never escaped it. It's kind of wild how something that small can completely define someone's reputation at work. This next story is about some clueless landlords who tried to bend the rules in their favor, only to end up trapping themselves in their own malicious compliance. A few years back, I was renting a basement apartment with a roommate. Things were pretty normal at first, until the owner of the building decided to sell. That's when our upstairs neighbors, of all people, swooped in and bought the place. Overnight, they went from neighbors to landlords, and let me tell you, they had absolutely no idea what they were doing. From the beginning, it was clear they didn't see tenants as people with rights, but more like walking wallets. Rent shot up, rules got weird, and they acted like owning the property made them kings of the castle. Their first draft of a contract spelled it out perfectly. They wanted the right to enter our unit at any time and go through our stuff whenever they felt like it, just because we were living on their property. I called them out immediately, pointing out how illegal that was. They got red in the face, muttering about how they'd see about that. Sure enough, by the time we actually signed the lease, that little clause magically disappeared. But the best moment, the one that still makes me laugh, was when they ended up maliciously complying against themselves. One day, our only fire alarm stopped working. No big deal, right? We just reached out like any normal tenants would, letting them know it needed replacing. Their response? A smug little, "So what?" I explained calmly that we needed to have a working fire alarm. That's not just common sense. It's the law, and it's specifically the landlord's responsibility. Their answer was, "No, it's not. You want one, you buy it." I pushed back, pointing out the law again, and that's when they made their fatal mistake. They fired off this sarcastic reply. "Oh, it does it? Well, we'll just see what the fire marshal has to say about that." I don't think I've laughed harder at a text message in my life. They really thought they caught us bluffing, that the fire marshal would come down, wag his finger at us, and tell us we were in the wrong. We just said, "Okay, yeah, do that." Fast forward to the next morning. There's frantic knocking at our door. Standing there was the landlord and his entire family, looking pale and panicked. In their arms, a bag full of brand new fire alarms. Not just one replacement, but one for every single room, plus a couple of extras for good measure. They begged us to let them in right away, even though they hadn't given the required 24 hours notice. They called it an emergency. Suddenly, they were all apologies, rushing through our place to mount alarms in every corner. They kept saying things like, "Sorry for the delay," and "If you need anything else, don't hesitate to ask." The whole time, my roommate and I were barely holding it together, trying not to burst out laughing while they scrambled. Whatever conversation they'd had with the fire marshal, or whoever they spoke to, clearly hadn't gone the way they expected, because now, instead of us chasing them down, they were the ones tripping over themselves to comply. They thought they were calling our bluff, but in the end, they only ended up exposing their own ignorance and doing way more than we ever asked for. That's where the story ends. Man, landlords like that really do dig their own graves. They tried to play power games, but the law wasn't on their side, and it blew up right back at them. It's kind of funny how they went from brushing it off to installing alarms in every room like their lives depended on it. Honestly, it's the kind of instant karma that makes you feel like the universe sometimes gets it right. This next story is about a theme park lead who dodged responsibility, leaving his team to take the blame when things went wrong. This happened back when I was 17, working at a big theme park. I'd been there long enough to really learn the ropes, and I'd gotten a reputation for being the responsible one whenever it was just a bunch of teens running a ride. Our so-called leader was a college intern named M, but he wasn't great at leading and honestly didn't care much about training new hires. At the ride I mainly worked, it took 3 people minimum to run it safely. 1 person in the control booth, 1 at the entrance, and 1 at the exit. If things got super busy, we could add more staff to help with the crowds. Since the entrance and control booth couldn't see the person at the exit directly, we relied on radios. There was a camera in the booth too, and we also had a set of hand signals we were trained to use from day one. These signals were standard across the whole park, just in case radios ever failed. That training wasn't just for show either. Earlier that summer, 3 newly certified employees had started the ride while someone was still inside the safety fence, not in a seat where they belonged. Twice it was another employee, once it was a guest, which was a huge deal. Each time it only got caught because others screamed at the operator to hit the emergency stop. Those mistakes got people retrained or moved to easier rides. One day, the park was packed. We had 5 of us working the ride, including me and M. After about an hour, M was called to another ride. Normally that wasn't a big deal, but then one of our team's shifts ended, and suddenly we were shorthanded. I called over to the other ride, asking for M to come back, but instead of sending him, they sent someone else. That was strange, but I didn't think too much of it at the time. Another hour passed. Another teammate was scheduled to leave, and M still hadn't returned. By now, all the radios were running out of battery. Things had slowed a little, so I volunteered to take the radios to the office for fresh batteries. It only took me about 10 minutes, and during that time, the others just used hand signals like we'd been trained to do. When I got back, though, instead of M, they had once again sent someone else. At this point, I was starting to realize M was probably just hanging out in an air-conditioned booth somewhere, avoiding responsibility. The replacement this time was a guy who usually worked at a roller coaster. He hadn't been at our ride in over a month, so I gave him a quick refresher. I turned away for maybe half a minute when I suddenly heard shouting. I spun around, and there it was. The ride was stopped just a few feet off the ground, and our entrance attendant was locked inside the safety fence. Thankfully, the guy at controls realized what he'd done and slammed the emergency stop immediately. That alone set him apart from the others who had messed up earlier that summer. Still, it was bad. We had to call upper management, and wouldn't you know it, M came running over right then, acting like he'd been involved all along. This time, the higher-ups came too. They separated us, interrogated each of us individually, and then huddled together for a long discussion. Their decision? They fired the guy at controls on the spot. Then they found excuses to remove the rest of us from working rides, clearly just trying to make an example out of us. I was furious, especially because the only reason that guy had been at controls in the first place was because M hadn't been doing his job. I tried to call M out, but I was still an anxious kid and it didn't carry much weight. What really burned me was that they pinned the bulk of the blame on me. See, earlier I had taken the radios to recharge the batteries. Management twisted that into saying I had removed communication devices from the ride area, which supposedly caused the mistake. Never mind the fact that the mistake happened after I came back with the radios. Never mind that we had a whole system of hand signals for exactly this situation. It was obvious M had thrown me under the bus, trying to cover for his absence. I refused to sign the paperwork they tried to get me to sign, which would have been admitting fault. That dragged the whole ordeal out over several days. And since I was heading to college in just a couple of weeks, I wasn't about to spend my last summer days scrubbing bathrooms because management wanted a scapegoat. Their solution was a new rule. If a single radio battery was dying, we couldn't handle it ourselves. We had to call a manager to bring a replacement no matter what. And if a radio died, the ride had to shut down completely until it was replaced. The next day, my radio battery started fading. Following the new rules, I called a manager. Half an hour passed and no one came. I called again. Still nothing. Finally, my radio died, so I shut down the ride completely. Guests who had been waiting over an hour in line were furious, and when I explained that the rule was we couldn't operate without radios, they got even angrier at how absurd it was. Right then, the manager showed up with a fresh battery. I smiled, took it, and reopened the ride. A bunch of guest complaints came in after that, and suddenly management decided that maybe, just maybe, hand signals were fine after all. Funny how quickly rules change when they backfire. I never did sign that paperwork. I went off to college, and by chance, M went to the same one. I ran into him once. He gave me a nod, I gave him a dirty look, and that was that. The next summer, the park actually rehired me, but this time as a lead. And unlike M, I actually did my job. That's the end of this story. It's crazy how fast management will turn on people just to cover themselves. The fact that they punished the ones actually working while the so-called leader sat out says a lot. I like how the petty compliance with that new rule instantly showed how useless it was though. And honestly, the storyteller getting rehired as a proper lead feels like the best kind of payback. This next story is about a condo HOA president who used her influence to get someone fired over a computer glitch. I had just started a new job as a concierge and security guard for a high-rise condominium downtown. It sounded like a decent gig, steady hours, clear responsibilities, and a professional setting. But within a week, I realized one person in that building had the power to make life miserable, the HOA president. She was an older woman who honestly made it hard for me to keep a straight face. She had this routine where she'd smile and act polite when tenants were around, but the second they walked away, she'd start talking trash about them. Then, as soon as they came back into the lobby, she'd plaster that same sweet smile right back on. It wasn't just tenants either. She'd talk badly about my manager in front of me, which made me wonder what she was saying about me when I wasn't around. She also had this habit of oversharing about her past. Almost every shift, she'd bring up her divorce from years ago, bragging about how she won because she caught her husband and best friend cheating and walked away with all the money. She told the story so often that it felt like she was keeping score every time she mentioned it. And then there was her dog, an aggressive little thing that tried to attack every other dog that passed through the lobby. Instead of controlling her own pet, she'd scold the other owners, telling them to keep their dogs under control. Things came to a head only 6 shifts into my job. The building had just upgraded to a 24-hour surveillance system with 24 HD cameras, each recording non-stop. That meant the computer in the lobby was being hit with a massive amount of data every single day, with no breaks, no updates, and no restarts. Honestly, I could tell the system was on the verge of crashing. As staff, we were required to lock the computer screen whenever we left the desk. So, one night, I did a patrol, came back, logged in, and saw that every single Chrome tab had crashed. It wasn't surprising given how much the system was handling, but apparently, the Shoei president had set up 2-factor authentication for every app. That meant she got an immediate alert when something glitched. She walked over to help me log back in, and at first she was calm. She said, "Now, I'm not saying this is your fault, but next time you need to use this particular function so it doesn't happen again." I nodded and followed her instructions, thinking that was the end of it. But a few hours later, I went on another patrol, locked the screen like I was supposed to, and when I returned, the exact same thing happened again. The system crashed, Chrome tabs down, everything. By the next morning, my HR representative called to let me know I was no longer employed. 6 shifts in, and just like that, I was out of a job. It was pretty clear who had pushed for that decision. The HOA president had all the money, all the influence, and apparently the final say. But here's where my little revenge comes in. For the past few days, I've been using her online business to sign her up for every single free catalog I can find. Gardening catalogs, clothing catalogs, furniture catalogs, you name it. At this point, she has around 60 different free catalogs headed her way, and I'm not stopping anytime soon. The way I see it, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. If she wanted to ruin my job over something I couldn't control, then she's going to spend the next few months buried under piles of useless paper she never asked for. She wanted to press the button. I'm just showing her what happens when the other side pushes back. That's where this story ends. It's wild how some people treat power like a toy. They can just swing around whenever they feel like it. The funniest part here is that all that control she flexed over a computer crash is being repaid in something as simple as a mountain of catalogs. It's low-level revenge, but it'll eat at her patience over time. And honestly, there's something kind of satisfying about knowing every day she checks her mail. She's reminded of the person she pushed out after 6 shifts. This next story is about a hotel worker dealing with an entitled guest and her father, who not only refused to follow basic check-in rules, but also threw in a derogatory comment to make things worse. A couple of months ago, I made a personal decision to start wearing a headscarf at work. For the most part, people had been kind and respectful about it. But one night, I ran into the exact type of person you'd expect to have a problem with it. It was around 9 in the evening when I got a call at the front desk. A woman was on the other end, saying there was a maintenance issue in her room. Nothing unusual, except when I pulled up the reservation, there was no one checked into that room. At first I thought maybe it was a system glitch. I searched the database by name, by number. Nothing. No record of her or anyone else being checked in, which of course left me wondering how they had gotten into the room at all. I explained that to her, and asked if she could come down to the desk so we could sort it out. She immediately scoffed and started talking to her father in the background. That's when he got on the line, demanding answers. He insisted he had already paid, and when I repeated that nothing showed on our system, he slammed the phone down. Not wanting to leave it hanging, I called back just to confirm they were coming down. He barked at me that he'd be down right now, and hung up again. About 10 minutes later, the two of them showed up in the lobby. The daughter tried to joke about how they couldn't possibly not be checked in if they had keys to the room. I told her I didn't know how that had happened, but that they still needed to officially check in. That's when the father shoved his phone in my face, showing what looked like a charge. I explained that while I didn't know exactly what he was looking at, it wasn't for tonight's stay. His daughter jumped in again, laughing, saying, "We shouldn't have to compensate for your guys' mistake." Things went back and forth like that for a while. Me calmly saying they needed to check in properly, them insisting they already had. Then it escalated. The daughter started demanding to see a manager, and right in the middle of that, her father looked at me and said, Oh, so is there even more of you with headscarves? The implication was obvious, and it crossed a line instantly. At that point, I told them they had 15 minutes to leave or the police would be called. The daughter tried to stall, calling customer support and dragging her father toward the elevator, but I wasn't budging. When the police arrived, even they asked if I would consider letting the family stay since it was late, and they had kids with them. I told them absolutely not. The officers escorted them out. On their way out, the father had one last move. He stopped at the desk, placed a Bible on the counter, patted it, and said, "You'll need this," then finally walked out. Later, we discovered how the whole mess started in the first place. When they first arrived, the father had given the morning desk agent the wrong confirmation number. The reservation they had actually prepaid for was dated for a month later, not that night. That's why they had a charge on their phone, and that's how they got keys in the first place. But even after all that, they still expected to stay without fixing the mistake, while throwing insults at me in the process. Honestly, it was just another Tuesday dealing with the general public. That's where this story ends. It's pretty eye-opening how quickly some people's entitlement comes out the second things don't go their way. A simple mistake on their part could have been cleared up easily, but instead it turned into insults, arguments, and dragging cops into the mix. What stood out most wasn't even the booking issue. It was how fast the dad went straight to being rude instead of listening. Stuff like that reminds you that working with the public is never boring. This next story is about a hotel worker dealing with an entitled guest who demanded special treatment, parked where he wanted, and even made a creepy comment when called out. The moment this man walked in to check in, I had a gut feeling he was going to be trouble. It wasn't just the attitude. It was the way he introduced himself. He gave me his last name, and when I repeated it back to confirm, he immediately corrected me. "That's doctor." And of course, he demanded 4 bottles of water right off the bat. Now, I've worked enough night audit shifts to know what's coming when someone insists on being addressed by their title. Sure enough, the holier-than-thou energy was there. I checked him in and started my usual spiel about breakfast hours, coffee, and all that. Halfway through, he cut me off and told me to talk slower and softer because they were tired. Fair enough, I do tend to speak quickly, so I repeated everything more slowly. Then he grumbled that I was going too slow. At that point, I just wanted him out of the lobby, so when he demanded 2 more waters, I gave them. By then, I'd already handed him 3 times the amount guests usually get. His wife wasn't any better. She asked for extra towels, which I brought, then more towels, then tissues, then some other random items. But instead of asking for it all at once, she had me running back and forth several times like it was some kind of game. She forgot the tissue, and later when her husband came down, I was already on the phone helping someone else. He stood there, loudly talking over me, demanding his tissue. I handed it over with a smile since it was sitting on the desk, but I didn't say anything because I was still mid-call. He took offense to that too, acting like I'd just personally insulted him. Not long after, I noticed a car parked directly under our main awning. At first, I assumed someone was idling or unloading luggage, but the car was empty. I let it sit for nearly an hour before running the plates, and of course, it was his. Perfect. I called the room and told him he couldn't park there. The space in front of the doors wasn't meant for guest parking. It was for quick drop-offs and safety access. He got instantly huffy and accused me of interrupting his meal. He demanded to know why he couldn't park there if my car was parked off to the side. Here's the difference. I don't have a key card that lets me enter from every side door of the building like guests do. Management allows me to park in a specific spot off to the side by the gardens for my safety, especially since I work overnight and leave when it's still dark. Plus, parking is limited and we need spaces left for paying guests. My car was tucked out of the way. His was sitting directly in front of the doors, blocking access for anyone who might need to unload. Instead of listening, he started yelling at me about how unfair it was. He said I shouldn't be allowed to park there because there wasn't a sign saying employees could. And in the same breath, he argued that he should be allowed to park under the awning because there wasn't a sign saying he couldn't. The mental gymnastics were unreal. He got angrier, wrote down my name and my license plate number, and then made a bizarre comment about how I might end up on a gurney in his hospital. At that point, I honestly wanted to kick him out, but eventually, he stormed off back to his room. I spent the rest of the shift tucked away in the back office until day shift came in. Working nights always seems to bring out the wildest people. That's where this story finishes. Some guests really just go out of their way to make everything harder than it has to be. What stood out most here wasn't even the parking or the towels. It was the need to constantly be the center of attention. The way he twisted the rules to suit himself was almost laughable if it wasn't so frustrating. And then that weird hospital comment, that crosses into unsettling territory. It's a good reminder of how unpredictable working nights can be. This next story is about a pair of neighbors who thought they could keep stealing gas without consequence, only to find themselves on the receiving end of a very costly lesson. Back when spring cleanup season rolled around each year, my buddy Boris and I always teamed up. We'd tackle 1 yard at a time, trimming trees, prepping garden plots, sharpening tools, and getting everything in shape. It was one of those yearly routines we actually looked forward to. The night before it was my turn, I prepped everything. Chains sharpened, mower blade ready, and mixed up fresh 2-cycle gas for the smaller equipment. I left all the cans in the shed, thinking nothing of it. The next morning, Boris showed up with coffee and biscuits, and as we sat on his tailgate, we saw my neighbors, let's call them Rocky and Bullwinkle, roll past in their beat-up Chevy Cavalier. The car was smoking like a chimney, and we joked about how they probably put oil in the tank instead of gas. But when Boris and I went to pull out the equipment, I realized all my gas cans were gone. That's when it hit me. The reason their car was smoking so badly was because they stole my gas and poured in straight 2-cycle mix. I was furious. There wasn't much I could do in that moment, so we went out, bought new cans and oil, and carried on with the cleanup. But I didn't forget. A week or two later, at a family dinner with my wife's relatives, who also happened to be Rocky and Bullwinkle's grandparents, I spotted one of my missing cans sitting by the shed. It still had the distinctive paint marks I'd put on it. When I asked the grandfather about it, he casually mentioned they'd left it there. I explained it was mine, loaded it into my truck, and that's when an idea started to form. I bought more fuel, but this time I mixed up something special: gas, diesel, and a cocktail of other oils. I filled one of my new cans with it, and made sure Rocky and Bullwinkle saw me mowing the lawn with regular gas before forgetting to put the other can away. The next day, it was gone. Later, my wife told me their car had been sputtering, smoking worse than ever, and eventually broke down on the main road. They came to me, panicked, asking for help. I told them I had a migraine and maybe I'd take a look tomorrow. They admitted the car wasn't insured, which meant when the highway patrol found it, it was impounded. It would cost them hundreds to get it back, more than the car was even worth. As luck would have it, a local pastor gave them an old Ford Taurus. I doctored up more fuel, and after a month, that engine seized too. They eventually scrapped it, bought themselves a Ford F-150 with their tax return, and even that started having smoking problems until a mechanic figured out the bad gas had ruined things. By then, they were out $1,500 in repairs. And after all that, funny enough, I've never had gas go missing again. That's where this story ends. That was such a creative way to handle it. Instead of chasing after them or getting into shouting matches, he let karma play out through a little bit of trickery. What stood out most was how the neighbors kept bouncing back with new cars, only to hit the same wall again and again. It's the kind of long game payback that feels almost poetic. This next story is about neighbors who turned their apartment into a secret lockdown party spot, keeping everyone awake while breaking the rules, until things escalated all the way to the press and the university. Back in September of 2020, I got new neighbors, 2 young women who moved into the apartment next to mine. Not long after settling in, they decided to throw a party. Normally, I wouldn't care too much, but Belgium was in full lockdown at the time, and you weren't supposed to have more than one fixed visitor. On top of that, I worked in healthcare, and not just any part of it. I had volunteered for the ad hoc COVID team, meaning I was working long shifts with sick and quarantined residents, then biking an hour each way to get home. By the time I walked in my door, I was completely drained. The last thing I needed was a wild party next door. Still, I tried to be patient. I can handle some music, some noise, that's part of city life. But this wasn't just noise. People were shouting in the hallways, things were being broken, and by 4 a.m, I had had enough. I knocked, introduced myself, and asked when they expected their 20-plus guests to leave. I also asked them to please skip the next night because I had to be up at 6 for work. They promised to quiet down and said no more parties. Of course, they partied the next night anyway, and the night after that. By the 3rd sleepless night in a row, I was running on fumes. Every time I asked them to stop, I got the same apologies, but nothing changed. Walking into their packed apartment felt awful too, because I worked with vulnerable people who I didn't want to expose to risk. Finally, the weekend came. They went to their parents' houses, and I caught up on sleep, but I was already fed up. Over the next weeks, they didn't throw huge parties, but their apartment turned into a revolving door. The doorbell rang dozens of times a night. Drunk students came and went, yelling in the echoing hallway at all hours. I couldn't sleep on weeknights, only Friday through Sunday when they were gone. Eventually, my upstairs neighbor and I teamed up. He explained what was really happening. They were running a makeshift bar. With all the bars closed, their place in the frat house across the street became hangouts. Students bounced between the two houses all night like it was a pub crawl. We tried talking to the girls. We tried talking to the visitors. Nothing worked. Most laughed in our faces or were too drunk to listen, so we started calling the police, dozens of times. But if the girls didn't open the door, the police said they couldn't do much. We wanted a record in the system, but it was frustrating. When the police couldn't help, I turned to what I knew best, making calls. I reached out to student unions, town hall, anyone who might step in. Finally, on my neighbor's suggestion, I emailed one of the girls' dean. I kept it polite but firm, explained the situation, pointed out the illegal gatherings, and hinted that we were ready to go public since the press was already covering secret lockdown parties. The dean called me right away. Within a day, he had phoned the student and her parents. Big drama followed. When we sat down with the girls, there were tears, apologies, and a promise to do better. But instead of stopping, they just shifted their partying across the street to the frat house. The noise continued. The rules were still broken, and now the second COVID wave was hitting. My upstairs neighbor even filmed one of their parties. I posted the clip on our country's subreddit to test the waters, and people were overwhelmingly sick of students ignoring restrictions. That's when we decided it was time to go to the press and to the vice rector, who could start disciplinary action. Everything snowballed. Local news picked up the story, confirmed with police that they'd been called dozens of times, and published an article. Then national outlets ran it too, with headlines about selfish students keeping healthcare workers awake while breaking lockdown rules. Soon after, a film crew was outside our building for the evening news. To top it off, one of the frat house students actually admitted on camera that they'd been hosting illegal parties and not letting cops in. The university launched an investigation. Before the hearing, we spoke to the girls again, and because we put in a few good words, they got off lighter. 40 hours of community service and probation. The frat boys across the street got 80 hours each and had to write us letters of apology, which I admit I thoroughly enjoyed reading. After all that, things finally calmed down. A simple WhatsApp message was enough to quiet any noise for the rest of the year. That's where the story ends. What struck me the most here is how long it took before anyone actually took the situation seriously. The neighbors tried being patient, tried talking, tried calling the police, and nothing changed until the press and the university got involved. The detail about the frat boy bragging to the news crew was wild. That basically sealed their own case. Honestly, it shows how even the calmest, most tolerant people can be pushed to a breaking point when they're exhausted and disrespected night after night. This next story is about a custody battle made messier by betrayal, lies, and one clever revenge against a so-called friend. This happened over 5 years ago, and even now, it still feels like one of my proudest moments. Back then, I was dating this guy named Dan. He was in the middle of a tough custody battle with his ex, Rachel, over their little toddler. It was a stressful time, but Dan was doing his best to stay present and prove he was a good dad. We both worked at the same bar, along with a girl named Billie Jean. At first, everything seemed fine. Billie Jean had known Dan for years, and she had even worked with Rachel before. On the surface, everyone seemed civil, almost like they were all trying to keep things friendly despite the circumstances. But behind the scenes, it wasn't as civil as I thought. Billie Jean had secretly taken Rachel's side. Out of nowhere, Dan ended up with a copy of an affidavit that she had written for the custody case. I don't even remember how the paperwork fell into our hands, but I'll never forget the feeling I had reading it. Page after page, Billie Jean just flat out lied about Dan. She twisted situations, exaggerated stories, and painted him as someone he wasn't. Now, I absolutely cannot stand liars, and when it involves using a kid as leverage, that crosses a line for me. To know she was deliberately trying to sabotage his chance of being a father, just to help Rachel, made my blood boil. Dan wasn't a bad dad, not even close, and Billie Jean knew that. The thing is, Billie Jean wasn't exactly beloved by everyone. She had enemies, people I happened to know, and people who had an easy reason to go after her. One of those reasons, she had bought a car from them and wasn't paying for it. She'd been ducking them, ignoring payments, and thought she could get away with it. That's when the light bulb went off. I picked up the phone and called her enemies. I came in peace, told them I wasn't there to cause trouble, and asked if they had her address to get the car back. They didn't, but I did, and I passed it along without hesitation. It didn't take long. Billie Jean called me soon after, furious and panicked because her car had been repossessed. She was trying to piece together who could have ratted her out, and she said it could have only been two people, me or her ex, Robbie. She was so sure it had to be one of us. I'll never forget the moment. She asked me straight up, and I casually told her, I don't think it was Robbie. She snapped back, well, who would have done it then? I could barely keep it together. I held back laughter and played dumb, throwing in some over-the-top fake confusion like, oh, I don't know, that's so weird, until she finally hung up. Meanwhile, Dan was sitting next to me in the car, trying not to burst out laughing. Not long after, the pieces fell into place. Dan won shared custody of his child, which was all he ever wanted. And Billie Jean? Without her car, she couldn't make the commute to her job an hour away, so she ended up losing that too. To this day, I still wonder if she ever figured out that it was me who set that chain of events in motion. All I know is I don't like liars, and she learned the hard way not to cross that line. That's where the story ends. That one made me laugh. The timing of it all just couldn't have been better. What stood out most was how calm the response was on the phone, just playing dumb while she dug her own frustration deeper. Honestly, it's wild how fast things can flip when someone thinks they're untouchable. Sometimes the quiet moves hit the hardest. This next story is about a shady homeowners association that tried to scam a whole neighborhood until one mom decided she'd had enough. This all went down more than 5 years ago, and it's still one of those family stories we look back on with pride. When my parents first moved into our neighborhood, my older sibling was just a toddler, and I was basically a little glowworm still in diapers. Back then, there actually was a homeowners association in place. They collected money every month from residents, supposedly to handle things like snow removal and trash collection. For a while, my parents didn't think much of it. The roads were cleared in the winter, the trash got picked up, so they figured, alright, maybe the HOA is doing something. But here's the thing, they weren't. The city was the one sending out snowplows and garbage trucks. The HOA was just riding on the illusion that they were providing services. And then came the tree project. The HOA proudly announced they were going to plant new trees all over the neighborhood. Sounds nice, right? Except the company they hired just happened to be owned by the son of the head of the HOA. Total coincidence, I'm sure. That was the beginning of the end. The day the trees arrived, my grandma happened to be visiting. Now, my grandma isn't just someone who likes plants. She's a certified master gardener. So when she saw the workers unloading the saplings, she immediately knew something was wrong. Instead of digging holes or even cutting open the bags around the roots, these guys just tossed the bagged saplings straight onto the grass. Dozens of little trees lying there like sad sticks, roots still wrapped in plastic. My grandma took one look and said, "Those are gonna die if they don't get planted." And that offhand comment set something off in my mom's head. She was working full-time, raising 2 kids, juggling daycare, preschool, and babysitters, and still paying monthly fees to an HOA that couldn't even be bothered to plant a tree properly. That was it. She marched right over to the head of the HOA's house and demanded that they actually do the job they were taking money for. Instead of being embarrassed, the HOA made their second mistake. They asked if Mom wanted to join. She said yes. At the next meeting, she showed up and saw the truth. Just a handful of members, barely 5 people, all close friends or family of each other. None of them were even paying dues like the rest of the neighborhood. Every so-called contractor they hired was just another relative pocketing money. The whole thing was a family cash grab. That summer, Mom decided she was going to tear the whole thing down. She dug through years of records and paperwork, carting me along in a stroller while my sibling was at school. And she discovered something huge. Not only did the HOA provide no real services, They weren't even supposed to be in our neighborhood. Their official zone was somewhere else entirely. So, she went to work, door to door, block after block, handing out pamphlets she'd written in both English and Spanish so every resident could understand what was happening. Pamphlets explaining that they were being scammed, that the city was already providing services, and that they didn't have to pay another cent to this bogus HOA. And she didn't stop there. She hired a lawyer. She hired an accountant. It wasn't cheap, but she was determined to protect the neighborhood. Another resident stepped in to help her sort through the evidence, though eventually they had to back out because of work. Still, Mom pressed on. By the time she walked into the courthouse, with a lawyer on one side and an accountant on the other, she had everything she needed: proof of fraud, records of false charges, and evidence that the HOA wasn't even legally valid in our area. The judge shut them down hard. The homeowners association was dissolved, the fraudsters were exposed, and our neighborhood was finally free. That was almost 19 years ago. And since then, not a single person has dared try starting up another HOA where we live. That story wraps up here. Honestly, I love this one. What stands out is how it wasn't just luck. It was persistence. She juggled work, kids, and still found the time to dig through papers and rally the neighborhood. The image of her pushing a stroller while handing out pamphlets is just so good. And it's wild to think that one person's determination literally reshaped the whole neighborhood for decades. That's power in its most grounded form. This next story is about a client who tried to get out of paying for an installation job, only to regret messing with the wrong professional. Back when I worked for a company that made specialized manufacturing equipment, I built up a lot of client relationships. These machines weren't simple. Installing one could take the better part of a day, and maintenance was just as demanding. After a few years, I left that job for something new, but apparently one old customer never let go of my number. His name was Jake. One afternoon, he called me up, sounding desperate. He told me his company had a new unit that needed installing and another that needed servicing, and he wanted to know if I was available. I explained that I didn't work there anymore and could pass him along to someone who could help, but Jake insisted. He said the company had raised installation rates so high that they couldn't afford them anymore. He dangled an offer in front of me: double my current pay rate if I came in on the weekend and did the work for him. He even said his own engineers had tried to follow the written instructions, but they were just scratching their heads in confusion. He practically begged me. After a moment, I agreed. Now here's the deal with these machines. The company gives you two choices: either pay for a professional installer or try to save money and attempt it yourself using the instruction packet they send. The catch? If you start installing it yourself, the company won't get involved later, because they can't verify whether the equipment was broken or just mishandled. That little detail is important to the story. So that weekend, I drove down and got started. The place was stacked with boxes, but I knew what I was doing. For hours, I tightened bolts, ran cables, and made sure everything was aligned just right. After about 6 solid hours, I was nearly finished when Jake strolled in. He gave me this half smile and then dropped the bomb. "Sorry, but we just don't have the budget to pay you." He told me his engineers would take it from here. I was furious. I had just wasted an entire day. But instead of blowing up, I decided on a little quiet revenge. You see, tucked inside that unit was a tiny button that flips it into test mode. Normally it's only used during maintenance, and it's deliberately hidden. You need a pin to press it. There's no mention of it in the official installation instructions, and no obvious indicator when it's on. The machine just won't work properly. So I pressed the button, packed up my tools, and left. By Monday morning, Jake was already calling me nonstop. I ignored every attempt. I knew exactly what was happening. The unit wouldn't configure, his engineers had no idea why, and my old company wouldn't touch it since someone else had already started the installation. He was trapped. After a few days of missed calls, I finally answered. Jake was livid. He demanded to know why I wasn't picking up and begged me to come back and fix it. I calmly reminded him, "Why would I help you? You refused to pay me." He tried backpedaling, apologizing, and said they'd work something out if I came right away. I refused. I told him flat out, "You're going to pay me $7,000 up front before I even touch it." He yelled, he cursed, he hung up. But the next day, sounding completely defeated, he called back. He apologized again and agreed to the terms. The money hit my account, and only then did I return. When I arrived, I pulled out a simple pin, pressed the hidden button, and flipped the unit out of test mode. In less than 20 minutes, the machine was configured and running smoothly. The look on Jake's face, pure confusion mixed with the realization that he'd just paid me £7,000 for 20 minutes of work, was absolutely priceless. Easiest money I've ever made. That's the end of the story. Man, that's such a satisfying setup and payoff. What I like most is how subtle the revenge was. Just one tiny hidden button turned the whole situation around. The fact that Jake had to sit there, helpless, while his engineers tried everything without realizing what was wrong, makes it even better. And honestly, watching him break down and hand over the money must have felt incredible after he tried to stiff you. That's the kind of move you don't forget. This next story is about a family dealing with entitled neighbors who kept stealing their parking spots, and one icy revenge that made sure it never happened again. This goes back about 20 years. My family owned 2 small apartment buildings, 3 units each. We lived in 2 of the units ourselves and rented out the other 4. The whole street was lined with these 3 flats, and parking was always a mess. Most buildings didn't have enough space, and on the side streets, there was barely any parking at all. We were lucky though. Since it was also our home, our property had more land than most. We could fit around 16 cars in our lot, plenty of room for us and our tenants. For decades, everything was fine. No problems, no drama. But then, cars that didn't belong to our tenants started showing up. At first, I tried being patient. Then one day, I blocked in a random car just to see who it belonged to. When the driver finally came out, they didn't say a word. They just drove straight through our bushes and across the yard to escape. That was it. I called the cops, but they told me there wasn't much they could do. So I called a tow company and had them put up warning signs. The agreement was simple. If anyone parked illegally, I could call, and they'd tow. The signs alone worked for a while. That is, until New Year's Eve rolled around. I got home that night, and every single space in our lot was filled. Cars were even blocking in other cars, parked sideways, jammed in wherever they could fit. I was furious. I called the tow company, but they were swamped and said it would be the hours before the day could send a truck. It was freezing outside. Chicago suburbs in the dead of winter, below 0. And that's when an idea hit me. I grabbed the garden hoses and some lawn sprinklers. I ran a hose through the laundry room faucet so the hot water kept it from freezing up, then set up the sprinklers across the lot. I moved them every half hour for almost 5 hours straight. By the time I was done, every car, every inch of the parking lot, even parts of the street, everything was encased in solid ice. I sprayed right into the locks, down between the windows and seals, into the grills. Every spot I could think of that would make starting those cars impossible. Then I packed everything away and went to bed. At 4 in the morning, the pounding started. Doors, doorbells, nonstop screaming and yelling. We just sat there smiling until the cops showed up. When they arrived, we went outside. The police officers were trying not to laugh as they looked at this frozen parking lot full of trapped cars. Turns out, all those people had been told to park there by a friend who lived a few buildings down, the same genius who once drove through our bushes. I pointed to the tow sign and told everyone their cars were getting towed unless they figured out how to move them. Since it was private property, the cops had my permission to ticket them too. In the end, every car got ticketed and towed. Nobody could even get inside their vehicles, let alone drive them away. I still wish we had it on video. That story wraps up here. That was just cold. Literally. What really gets me is the level of patience it took. Moving sprinklers every 30 minutes for hours just to make sure not a single car escaped the freeze. The image of people pounding on the door at 4 in the morning while everything outside looked like a frozen wasteland is hilarious. Honestly, that's one of those times where creative revenge feels way better than just calling a tow truck. This next story is about a maintenance director who took matters into his own hands after a cable company kept mistreating his senior residents. I'm the maintenance director at an independent senior living center. Basically, it's an apartment-style community where you have to be a senior citizen to live there. We provide meals, housekeeping, activities, transportation, and a bunch of other amenities designed to make life easier and more enjoyable. For a lot of the residents, this is where they'll spend their final years. So I take my role really seriously. Our one big rule as employees is simple. Make sure the residents are safe, happy, and living the best quality of life possible. Now, most of the residents spend their downtime listening to the radio, working on crossword puzzles, or watching TV. The thing is, we don't provide television service. It's something they have to set up themselves if they want it. Over the past year, that's been nothing but a headache. TVs in countless units stopped working, and when that happens, the residents understandably get really upset. Whenever I'd get a work order for a TV issue, I'd go check it out. Most of the time, it wasn't something I could fix. If the cable wasn't cut, everything was plugged in, and there was no obstruction to the satellite dish, then it usually meant a software problem. While they waited for service, I'd install an air antenna just to make sure they had something to watch. Then a tech from the satellite company would come out, fix it, and, like clockwork, within a couple of hours, it would stop working again. It turned into this never-ending cycle of frustration. I spent the better part of a year trying to escalate the problem. I asked supervisors to send someone out so we could walk the entire property together and address everything at once, but they refused. They wanted each resident to call individually, which is nearly impossible. A lot of them struggle to hear over the phone, let alone navigate 4-digit security codes and secret questions. I'll never forget one resident who went without service for over 60 days. I demanded they refund her properly. After all that time, they credited her just $21, not even half of a single month's bill. I told the representative on the phone that wasn't acceptable and, out of frustration, said I ought to toss all their dishes into the dumpster. That was just one example of how bad it had gotten. These companies caused so much damage to our property. They ran coax cables sloppily through gutters and downspouts, draped wires across sidewalks where people could trip, and even installed dishes right in the middle of courtyards. In some places, they left hundreds of feet of cable lying across the grass without even bothering to bury it. After repeatedly raising these issues with the facility's owner, he finally told me to handle it however I saw fit. That was all the permission I needed. I realized our best option was to cut out the satellite companies altogether and switch to a landline provider that didn't need dishes. So I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. I spent weeks running brand new coax lines to every single unit in the building. Then the new company came in and installed proper boxes and service in every apartment. Now, instead of paying monthly fees for unreliable satellite service, every single resident has television included in their rent at no extra cost. Those who never had service before now have it for free. In the end, more than 200 residents got reliable television, and over 50 of them are saving money every month. And honestly, it all felt like payback for the way one of their reps had spoken so rudely to Miss T. Watching the residents' relief when they realized they had dependable service was one of the best moments I've had in this job. That's the end of this story. That's honestly such a wholesome form of revenge. Instead of just fighting with the company endlessly, you completely cut them out of the picture and gave your residents something better. The detail that stands out to me is how much care you put into it, running all the coax yourself, making sure nobody was left out. It's kind of amazing how one rude rep sparked a change that ended up helping hundreds of people. That's a win on every level. This next story is about a shady bar owner who tried to dodge payments and the IRS, only to have it all come crashing down thanks to his accountant. One of my close friends is an accountant and he runs his own firm. Most of his clients are small to medium-sized businesses, so he's used to dealing with entrepreneurs and the ups and downs that come with their finances. He had this one client, we'll call him Scott, who owned 4 different clubs and bars spread across 2 cities. From the start, Scott was shady. He was always slow to pay his bills, always had excuses, and my friend was constantly chasing him down for money. I actually knew Scott too, because one of his bars hosted a weekly poker game I like to play in. One night, I was hanging out at my buddy's place, having a few beers, and he started venting about a client who owed him a lot of money. At first, he wouldn't say who it was, but after enough frustration, he finally admitted it was Scott. I was surprised. Scott's bar always seemed busy whenever I went. In fact, every Thursday night, it was packed, and he even ran this cash discount deal where you get 15% off your tab if you paid in cash. My buddy's eyes lit up when I told him that. He didn't say much at the time, but I could tell a light bulb had gone off in his head. A couple of weeks later, he called me up and asked if I was heading to the poker game at Scott's place. When I said yes, he asked if he could tag along. We played cards, had a few drinks, and afterwards he crashed at my place since I live closer. On the way over, he laid out his theory. He suspected Scott was underreporting a huge portion of his revenue. The cash discount wasn't just a promotion, it was a way to hide income. Cash is a lot harder to track, and Scott could easily pocket it without ever recording it in his books. My buddy decided to do a deep dive. Since he was Scott's accountant, he already had access to a lot of financial records. Purchases, payroll, rent, bills, all of it. He started piecing things together. The prices Scott charged for drinks, the amount of liquor he was buying, how much food was going out, and the revenue numbers Scott was actually reporting. The math didn't add up. There was no way Scott could be moving that much product and only reporting the numbers he was turning in. After weeks of digging, my buddy figured Scott was underreporting his sales by about 35 to 40% over the past year. And not only that, he discovered Scott had been hiding at least 20 to 25% of his income for years. That meant it wasn't just lying to him as the accountant, it was flat out tax fraud. By this point, Scott owed my friend thousands of dollars, easily enough to buy a brand new motorcycle. But instead of just trying to get his payment back, my buddy came up with another plan. He decided to file a report with the IRS whistleblower program. If you're not familiar, the program pays out between 15 and 30% of whatever money the IRS manages to recover. With the help of a lawyer, he gathered every piece of evidence: financial statements, inconsistencies, purchase records, everything, and filed the report. Then he dropped Scott as a client. It wasn't quick. There was a lot of back and forth, a lot of waiting, and plenty of legal wrangling. But eventually, the hammer came down. The IRS investigated Scott and found he had underreported roughly $4.5 million in income. His businesses didn't survive the fallout. My friend never told me exactly how much the IRS collected, but if you do the math, the whistleblower payout could have been anywhere from $675,000 to over $1 million. All he ever said to me was, "I don't have a mortgage anymore," and it would have been much cheaper for Scott to just pay me what he owed. That's where the story ends. That's such a wild, full circle moment. Scott thought he was being clever by hiding a little cash, but it turned into a multi-million-dollar problem. What really gets me is that all of this started because of one casual conversation over beers. The detail that stuck with me was my friend just saying he no longer has a mortgage. That's such a low-key way of admitting the payout was massive. Honestly, Scott really picked the wrong accountant to mess with. This next story is about a new manager who tried to cover up her mistakes by deleting evidence and blaming others, only for everything to unravel in the most unexpected way. At work, I was building an online training module meant to teach our finance team a new process. It had quizzes, interactive parts, and sample scenarios to walk through. It wasn't rocket science, but it was detailed enough to do the job. That's when our new associate director came in. From what I'd seen, she had a pattern of moving up the company ladder, not by being great at her job, but by throwing other people under the bus and coming out with less mud on her than everyone else. She got her hands on my draft, and instead of offering constructive feedback, she tore it to shreds. She complained it was incomprehensible, demanded it go into way more detail, and asked about nearly every single mouse click. The thing was, this module was designed for people with finance backgrounds who already knew the basics. She was a former social studies teacher trying to critique financial training. I tried to explain that to her, but she wasn't having it. So I had to bring her 20 pages of criticism back to the subject matter experts. They thought I was joking until I forwarded her email. For the next 2 weeks, we wasted everyone's time covering things like how to set up Outlook, how to set up email signatures, stuff people already learned in their 3-week training class. By the end of it, the 30-minute module had ballooned into a 3-hour mess. When I sent it back for review, she went silent. A week passed. Then the finance director asked why the module was so late. I went to forward her emails as proof of what I've been dealing with, but they were gone. Completely gone. Not just from my inbox, but from deleted items and even the sent folder. I checked with the subject matter experts. Same thing. Every email with a certain phrase she'd used had been wiped clean. A friend in IT dug around and found out someone had run a compliance delete on the entire Exchange server. That's usually reserved for wiping out phishing scams, not deleting specific criticism of a training module. My IT friend managed to recover the emails, so I saved everything to a flash drive. I even told the subject matter experts to save anything tied to her. At that point, I started keeping my own little evidence locker. Finally, she pushed the bloated module live, and the finance director hated it. He set up a meeting with both of us. The second the call started, she tried to pin everything on me, claimed I'd overdone it, said I must have swapped versions, even though that wasn't possible. She kept trying to talk over me until the finance director muted her. That's when I shared my screen, plugged in my flash drive, and pulled up every deleted email. Each one showed her demanding the exact changes she was now blaming me for. She immediately left the meeting. Soon after, the finance director asked me to send him copies, and I warned him they might mysteriously vanish again. When I explained the compliance delete, things blew up. An internal audit launched, and pretty soon word spread. The associate director and an IT manager, who just happened to be the one running the delete, both left the company to pursue the next stage of their careers. As the rumor mill churned, it came out they'd been having an affair. Not long after, both of their spouses filed for divorce. IT leadership went through a shakeup, and security started combing through everything to see what else had been covered up. Looking back, I think she wanted to make a dramatic entrance with an overstuffed masterpiece of a training module, but when it turned into a disaster, she tried to erase the trail and pin it on me. Instead, she ended up exposing her own mess and bringing her little side arrangement crashing down with it. That's where the story ends. What gets me here is how her own attempt to hide things only made it worse. If she'd just taken the loss and moved on, nobody would have looked deeper. Instead, her power move backfired in the loudest way possible. The detail that really stood out was the compliance delete. Like, the lengths she went to in order to cover herself were wild. And honestly, watching someone who thrives on throwing others under the bus get caught in their own trap feels oddly satisfying. This next story is about a tenant dealing with a landlord who refused to return his deposit, and how he found a creative way to get payback without throwing a single punch. Back in 2013, I was working as a dry liner, which meant I moved around a lot for jobs. Since most of my projects only lasted a few months, I was constantly renting flats or houses on short-term lets. Over the years, I dealt with my fair share of landlords. Some decent, some not so much. Normally, if one tried to keep my deposit, I'd just take the loss, move on, and never rent from them again. But one landlord in London pushed me just a little too far. At the time, I had landed a big job working on the new Wembley Stadium. So instead of a small flat, I rented a house I found in a local paper. The landlord also ran a pawn shop nearby, and everything seemed fine when we met. I paid him cash for the deposit and moved in that weekend. Over the next year, things went smoothly. I always paid rent on time, handled small repairs myself, and only had to call him once when the boiler went out. He sent someone over right away to fix it, and that was that. When the job started wrapping up, I went to his pawn shop to let him know I'd be moving out soon. I even said he could inspect the place while I was at work if he wanted. On my move-out day, I stopped by to hand over the keys and asked for my deposit back. He just looked at me and said, "What deposit?" I reminded him it was the month's rent I'd given up front as security, but he told me he was keeping it to cover damages. That made no sense. The house was in better shape than when I moved in. I pushed back, but he got in my face, stepped forward, and shoved me. He was taller, bigger, and clearly used to the gym. Now I'd served in the British Army with the Royal Green Jackets, and my training kicked in. I was ready to respond hard. But as I took that first step toward him, another thought hit me. I stopped, smiled, and just said, "Okay, bye." Then I walked out of his shop. What he didn't know was that I had a spare back door key I'd cut during my time living there, just in case I ever lost the original. Later that night, I let myself back in and spent one last evening in the house. But instead of relaxing, I got to work. Carefully, I removed every bit of wood inside. Doors, skirting boards, banisters, floorboards, architraves, you name it. I dismantled the kitchen units, rolled up the carpets, even lifted the wood flooring. I made sure not to break or damage anything. I just stacked everything neatly in piles in each room. The next morning, as I drove out of London toward my next job in Scotland, I couldn't resist twisting the knife a little more. I stopped by his pawn shop, pulled out a hammer, screwdriver, some nails, and a box of screws from my van, and handed them to his assistant. I told her, "You'll be needing these," and walked out. Hours later, while grabbing food at a service station near Nottingham, I switched my phone back on. What greeted me was a flood of texts and angry voicemails from my ex-landlord, each one more colorful than the last. I couldn't help but laugh to myself the whole drive north. That story wraps up here. I love how he didn't take the obvious route of fighting back. Instead, he outsmarted the landlord and made his point in a way that hit way harder than throwing punches ever could. The part that really got me was leaving the tools at the shop, like, here, you're going to need these. That's such a calm but devastating move, and honestly, it makes the whole revenge way more satisfying. This next story is about a fast food manager who was promised bonuses for extra shifts, only to get brushed off by a district manager who didn't want to pay up. Back when I worked at Wendy's as a manager, the job was already pretty rough. I was clocking about 65 hours a week, barely ever seeing a real day off. One week, I was offered a $100 bonus to work one of the few days I had free. I agreed, even though I was already exhausted. Later that same week, they asked me to cover another day. By then, I'd gone almost 23 days straight without a break. So I said fine, but this time I want $150. They agreed, and I came in. 3 weeks later, I still hadn't seen a dime. I kept asking about the money, and eventually my general manager told me to bring it up with our district manager. So later that night, I pulled him aside and asked, "Hey, what's going on with my bonus?" Between the 2 days, I'm owed $250. He looked nervous, and then gave me the most ridiculous excuse. He said the store wasn't making enough money, and basically tried to blame me for it. He said my shift wasn't pulling in the same revenue as others, and our drive-through times were higher. I told him straight up, we're running with half the staff and the same number of customers. It's going to take more time. He just shook his head and said, that's no excuse. When I asked again about the bonus, he admitted they weren't going to give it to me until revenue went up and times went down. I was speechless. I grew up in a place where you just didn't mess with someone's money, and now this guy was flat out telling me I wasn't going to get paid. I let a day pass to calm down, then talked it over with my crew, my girlfriend, my best friend, and another close coworker. All of them agreed to walk out with me, if that's what it came to. So I called the district manager. He declined my call. I called again. Declined. I tried a few more times before leaving him a voicemail. Look, Jakob, you need to talk to me. You've got until 8:45 to call me back, or the entire night crew is done. At the time, it was about 7:30. While I waited, I sat in the office watching my boss's email. She always left it logged in. Sure enough, about 20 minutes later, an email popped up. The subject line literally said, "Emergency Lonnie," my name. He wasn't going to call me. He wasn't going to make things right. He was just making sure my general manager could cover when I walked out. That was it for me. I got my whole crew together, and we walked. We left everything out. Meat, toppings, fryer still running. Just walked away. The next day I turned in my keys. A week later, my brother, who also worked at the store, called me. He said, Jakob lost all of his stores. He had to move back to Indiana. If you don't know, district managers get paid based on how many stores they run and how much those stores make. When he got moved, his pay dropped from about 65 grand a year to around 40. And all of that fallout was because he didn't want to pay me $250. That's the end of this story. Man, that's wild. It's crazy how a district manager can tank their own career over something so small. What stood out to me was how united the crew was. Walking out together like that takes trust. And the irony of him losing way more than what he owed you, that's the kind of ending you almost never see in real life. But it's so satisfying when it happens. This next story is about an underpaid salon worker who found a clever way to turn gossip and unfair pay practices into thousands of dollars gained. Back when I worked at a chain salon in the US, I was making minimum wage plus tips. On top of that, our pay was on a sliding scale. So the more services we sold, the higher our hourly pay. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Then back to school season rolled around, and the company decided to run a big promotion. $10 haircuts. Honestly, it made no sense to discount services during the busiest season of the year, but corporate didn't ask us. To advertise this sale, we were told to climb onto a wobbly step stool, lean out over an uneven sidewalk, and hang a massive banner, 10 feet long and 3 feet wide, off the roof. The banner read, $10 haircuts, with our logo stamped across it. We had to do this twice a day, once at open and once at close, because our manager insisted someone might steal it. I don't know who in their right mind would want to steal a giant salon banner, but we didn't have a choice. I was annoyed, but figured the paycheck would make up for it. I'd been pulling great numbers, so I expected a bump in my hourly pay. Instead, it was the lowest back-to-school paycheck I'd ever had. Turned out, the $7 discount from every haircut was being subtracted from our service totals. The promotion was literally coming out of our pockets. I was furious. The next morning, I was out with a coworker, the one who loved to gossip and suck up to management, setting up the banner. It was my turn on the rickety stool, and I casually told her, "Glad this is the last time I'll ever do this." She looked confused, so I told her not to tell anyone, but that I'd accepted a job at another salon. I made it sound perfect. Better pay, set hours, higher commission, $5 more an hour. I said I'd work through the weekend, and then I was gone. She swore she wouldn't say a word, which was exactly what I wanted. Sure enough, on my very next shift, my boss pulled me aside. She said she'd heard a rumor I was leaving. I acted cool and said it was true, but I'd stay if she could match the offer. Suddenly, I was promised a raise and, for the first time ever, a consistent schedule. I was already one of the top performers in the district, so the district leader approved it. I ended up staying another 5 years, earning an extra $39,000 from that accidental rumor alone. Plus, I pulled in 20% commission on product sales, which added up to hundreds more every week. But I wasn't done. I also started printing out my daily sales slips so I could prove what I'd actually earned before payroll adjusted the numbers with discounts. Whenever they tried to short me, I disputed it. Corporate kept saying their hands were tied, but I never let up. Eventually, another employee in a different state filed a class action lawsuit, and I joined in. Because I had 5 years worth of documentation and emails, the lawyers were thrilled. When it settled, they had to recalculate all of my paychecks, including free and discounted haircuts at full price. Between the back pay and the settlement split, I walked away with about $10,000 in cash plus all of the corrected wages. That story wraps up here. That's such a satisfying mix of petty and pro-revenge. What gets me is how one accidental slip to the store gossip ended up changing everything. The raise alone was huge, but then topping it off with a lawsuit payout, that's the kind of win that feels like slow burn justice finally paying off. It's wild how tiny details, like saving old pay slips, can end up making such a massive difference. This next story is about a shady landlord who handed over an unfinished building, leaving a company stuck in sweltering heat and unsafe conditions until the tenants found the perfect way out. So, my company was moving one of our remote sites into a new building. As the IT guy, it was my job to get all the network wiring set up. Normally, the landlord handles low voltage lines, but this guy flat out refused. The quotes to bring someone in were ridiculously high. So it was just me, my car, and 4 boxes of Cat 6 cable on an 8-hour drive. I had about 30 drops to run. Not the biggest job ever, but still. A few days of sweaty, messy work in a ceiling full of insulation. Day 1, we roll in on a Monday morning. At first it's fine. Cool, summer air outside, and nobody notices the AC isn't working. But by noon, the building is pushing 80 degrees, and by 3 o'clock, it's like an oven in there. Rooms with floor-to-ceiling windows turned into greenhouses. We later found out people had already told the leasing company about the broken AC weeks earlier. And to top it off, construction workers were still on site. The place wasn't even finished, yet they handed us the keys. Day 2, the misery continues. It's already 80 degrees when we walk in. By afternoon, it feels unbearable. Our facilities manager is losing his mind, screaming over the phone for someone to fix the air. When I poke my head above a ceiling tile, I find a 4-foot hole in the ductwork. Air was blowing, but nothing cold was coming through. Turns out the compressor was broken. Day 3, finally, a team of AC guys shows up. They tinker for a few hours, get it limping along, and when we ask what they fixed, their answer is a lot of things. Press them harder, and they say, "We can't tell tenants." Huge red flag. Later that night, our realtor emails us saying they changed the refrigerant from R22 to R410A. I just laughed. That's like dumping gasoline into a diesel truck. You'd have to change the whole system. No way they did that in 4 hours. They basically duct taped it together, hoping it would last just long enough to pass inspection. By day 4, it's still hot, still unfinished. And now I'm noticing something worse. The fire sprinklers look off. Some are sagging, others jammed down lower than they should be. The protective collars had literally fallen to the ground. That's when it hit me. The AC crew had been standing on the fire sprinkler lines to fix their ductwork. And sure enough, when I checked further, there was no fire panel, no alarms, no detectors hooked up to anything. Our entire section of the building had no active fire system. One of our guys casually mentions he'd never seen a building permit anywhere on site. That was it, the smoking gun. They'd done demolition, plumbing, electrical, and destroyed the fire system all without city permits. So we made a call to the city inspector's office. Day 5, the inspector shows up. No permits on file, multiple violations everywhere, and he immediately red tags our area. When he checked the fire system, he literally said, "Oh no, 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 I have to make a call." Next thing we know, the fire marshal is involved. By day 8, the fire marshal inspects and finds no alarm system, no water pressure in the sprinkler riser, which, by the way, supplied the whole building. They condemned the entire property. Every tenant got red tagged. The landlord went from trying to trap us in a 5-year lease to being stuck with a condemned building. We've already gotten our deposit and rent refunded, and now our lawyer is pushing for them to cover all the wasted time, the wiring work, and his own fees. And he says they don't have a leg to stand on. That's the end of this story. That's one of those situations where greed and shortcuts came back to bite the landlord hard. What stands out is how they kept trying to patch things together instead of just fixing them properly, and it ended up blowing up in their face. The part about the fire marshal condemning the whole building, that's just wild. Honestly, it's kind of satisfying to see incompetence catch up with people that fast. This next story is about a family who had to deal with nightmare neighbors throwing nonstop parties, and how they came up with a clever way to finally put an end to it. Back in the 90s, I went to school in California, but fast forward to just a few years ago, I finally bought a house in a quiet neighborhood I'd been eyeing for a long time. One of my best friends already lived there. It was close to my kids' school, and the place just felt right. For the first little while, everything was great. Then the pandemic hit. The good neighbors across the street had to move out right at the start, before eviction protections even kicked in. We were sad to see them go, but when a new family moved in, I was hoping we could build the same kind of friendly relationship. Unfortunately, it turned into the complete opposite. Within a month of them moving in, and right as lockdown started, things got out of control. Every single night, they'd throw these massive parties. Cars lined up and down the street, music blasting so loud I could hear it over the TV, or even through closed doors in every room. My buddy who lived in the next cul-de-sac would text me asking if the noise he heard was coming from my neighbors. That's how bad it was. At first I tried to keep it civil. I walked over, asked politely. I even brought them some beer and offered some good for 20 to try to get on friendly terms. Instead, they threatened me and my wife. That's when I started calling the police, almost every night for months. I got other neighbors to join in too, but eventually most of them gave up and even sold their homes just to get away. We couldn't, since we were still upside down on our mortgage. After a while, the police basically told me I was the nuisance for calling so much, and that it wasn't their problem to deal with. That was my breaking point. Around the same time, the housing market was exploding. Houses were going for $40,000 to $50,000 over appraisal. My wife and I ran the numbers, figured out what we'd need to walk away clean, and listed our place. Within 3 days, we had multiple offers, way over what we expected. But the one that caught my eye wasn't the highest. It was actually one of the lowest. The buyers had included a letter with a photo of themselves, a young pregnant couple, their dog, and in the background of the picture, a police patrol car. Turns out the guy was a brand new officer at the local police department, and yes, he brought his patrol car home. The second I saw that, I knew this was who I wanted to sell the house to. Money didn't matter. This was about poetic justice. We moved out right as the neighbors across the street were throwing one of their biggest parties yet. The very next day, the new family moved in. From that point on, the street was quiet. No more all-night chaos. No more music shaking the walls. Now when I drive by on the way to see my buddy, I'll see the new neighbors just sitting quietly in their garage looking bored. And of course, I always honk and wave. That's the end of this story. I love how that worked out, because it's one of those situations where the solution wasn't direct revenge. It was just setting the right pieces in place. The neighbors probably never expected their biggest headache would end with a cop moving in across the street. Honestly, that quiet garage scene at the end makes it all feel like perfect balance. This next story is about a shady client who tried to rip off a freelance developer, only to have the tables turned in the most devastating way possible. Back in the early 2000s, I was working as a freelance front-end developer and doing search engine optimization on the side. Back then, it was a lot easier to land websites on the front page of Google if you knew the right tricks. I had one site in particular that carried some serious authority because it was linked to directly from one of the most trusted websites in the world. I only used that leverage for my best clients, but when I did, it could send them leapfrogging right past their competition. One day, I got approached by this guy. I'll just call him Bob. He ran a travel package company and needed a complete overhaul of his basic site. The project was pretty complex, so I teamed up with a back-end developer and we dove in. Normally, I'd ask for a 25% deposit, but Bob refused. He said he'd been burned by a previous developer and didn't want to risk it. My gut told me this was a bad idea, but the money was good and I needed it, so I took the risk. We worked around the clock for a month. Long nights, early mornings, the whole deal. By the end, I was genuinely proud of what we had built. It was polished, professional, and ready to launch. But when it came time to deliver, Bob threw a curveball. He claimed he needed to see it running on his server before paying a dime. I pushed back, but he wouldn't budge. Against my better judgment, we uploaded the site to his server. And then, radio silence. No replies to my emails, no calls back, nothing. When I finally got him on the phone, he flat out told me, "I'm not ever going to pay you, and there's nothing you can do about it." That was the last straw. I sat there fuming, but then the idea hit me. If he wanted to play dirty, I could play smarter. I registered a domain with his company's name followed by sucks, built an exact mirror of his travel website, and linked it through my powerful SEO site. Within a month, my version was ranking above his for every single search. I didn't stop there. I also bought another domain with his full name plus sucks, and filled it with screenshots of his emails and warnings about his scam. Because his name was unusual, those sites ended up ranking above even his personal pages. A few months later, I started getting emails from people who had also been scammed by him. I added their stories too, packed with his name and company name so the keywords would stick. Pretty soon, every time someone searched for him or his company, the first thing they saw were pages full of complaints. Bob eventually tried to fight back. He sent me a fake cease and desist letter from a made-up law firm. I laughed and sent back his own words. "I'm not ever taking them down, and there's nothing you can do about it." At one point, he even tried to copy me, making a site with my name plus sucks, but it never even showed up in Google results. By then, the travel industry regulators had caught wind of my sites and opened an investigation into him. That's when Bob called me himself, desperate and begging me to take the sites down. He offered to finally pay me what he owed. Nothing extra, just what he owed from the beginning. I told him exactly what he once told me. "I'm not ever taking them down, and there's nothing you can do about it." Within a year, his entire business collapsed. His company was kicked out of the travel associations, his websites were buried under bad press, and he even lost his house because it was tied to the failing business. All because he tried to steal a website and thought I couldn't touch him. That story wraps up here. What I like about this one is how patient the revenge was. Instead of blowing up right away, he let the slow burn of SEO do the work, and that's what really crushed Bob in the end. It's almost funny to imagine him scrambling, registering domain after domain, not realizing he never stood a chance. That slow, quiet kind of payback always seems to hit the hardest. This next story is about a college roommate conflict where one person's constant cleaning clashed with messy housemates who didn't appreciate her efforts until she found a way to follow their rules a little too literally. Back when I was in college, I rented a small house with 3 guys. We were all in our early 20s, and as the only girl in the house, I quickly became the one doing most of the cleaning. I grew up with a mom who was a clean freak, so picking up shoes left in the doorway or moving laptops off the floor just felt natural to me. But instead of being grateful, my roommates would complain that I was hiding their stuff, even though I was putting it in totally reasonable places, like the closet or on a shelf. Things got even worse when one of the guys basically let his girlfriend move in. She didn't pay rent or utilities, but she was there constantly, using our one tiny bathroom like it was hers. She showered twice a day and filled the shower with her dozens of products: shampoo bars, conditioners, body scrubs, you name it. Cleaning around all of that was impossible. So I asked her to keep her things in his room and just bring what she needed when she showered. But apparently, that was asking too much. The final verdict from the group was clear: stop moving people's stuff. Just leave it where you found it. So I did. The next time I cleaned the shower, I didn't move her products. I sprayed everything down with scrubbing bubbles, bottles and all. Her fancy shampoo bar started dissolving, and all her other bottles turned into slippery messes. It didn't stop there. One day, a roommate's laptop cord was stretched across the living room floor. Normally I'd move it, but this time I just left it. Sure enough, I tripped, yanked the cord out, and the laptop died. Another time, the girlfriend and my roommate had shoes scattered across the rug in the living room. I needed to vacuum, so I rolled the whole rug up, with their shoes still inside. They asked me where I'd put them, and I just shrugged and said, I didn't put them anywhere. I left them where I found them. About half an hour later, when I unrolled the rug, there they were. They called me an asshole, but after that little shoe incident, things magically started changing. Suddenly, her products were neatly put away, shoes ended up in the closet, and laptops weren't left out in the middle of the floor anymore. That's where this story ends. What cracks me up here is how effective that approach was. She didn't yell, didn't fight, just followed their rules exactly. It's almost funny how fast their tune changed once they got a taste of what "leave it where you found it" really meant. Sometimes the best way to fix messy habits is to give people exactly what they asked for and let the results speak for themselves. This next story is about a customer who kept spoiling a favorite show until the comic shop employee found the perfect way to turn the tables. Back when I worked at a comic shop, we had a lot of regulars who came in every week. Over time, I got to know most of them pretty well. There was this one guy who told me he liked Stargate, and at the time I had just started rewatching it from the beginning. I mentioned to him that I'd never seen the last 3 seasons or any of the spin-offs, so I was excited to experience everything fresh. The first thing out of his mouth was a giant spoiler from the final season. I stopped him right there and said, "Whoa, no spoilers." That should have been enough, but it wasn't. Every week after that, he came in and dropped another spoiler. Sometimes it was small, sometimes it was huge, but every single time I told him not to do it, and every single time he smirked like he was enjoying it. This went on for about 2 months, until I realized he was clearly doing it on purpose. That's when I decided I wasn't just going to sit back anymore. I was going to spoil something for him. One week he came in to pick up a huge stack of comics he'd pre-ordered. I let him pay first, and then instead of bagging them up like usual, I spread them all out across the counter in front of him. What he didn't realize was that I read a ton of comics back then. In fact, I read almost every new issue from Marvel and DC the week they came out. So, I already knew exactly what happened in every single one of the comics he had just bought. I pointed to each book, one by one, and spoiled the ending, the twists, the reveals, all of it. The look on his face was priceless. He didn't know what to say. And funny enough, he never spoiled Stargate for me again after that. That's the end of this story. What makes this one so satisfying is how perfectly balanced the revenge was. He thought it was fun to ruin something you were excited about, but when it came back around to his own hobby, suddenly it wasn't funny anymore. Honestly, that little silent lesson probably worked better than any argument ever could. This next story is about a hotel guest who unleashed extreme hostility at tech support, only to face an unexpected response from hotel management. A couple of years ago, I was working at a company that mainly supported hotel Wi-Fi. Part of my role back then was handling escalated calls from guests when the regular support team couldn't resolve an issue. Around that time, a massive hurricane was tearing through Florida, and a lot of our hotels in northern Florida and Alabama were packed with people evacuating their homes. Guests were bringing all their possessions, and the hotels were stretched thin trying to accommodate everyone. One day, I got a message from our support team asking me to handle a call from one of these guests. They said he was having trouble connecting over a dozen devices to the Wi-Fi and flat out refused to cooperate with the first level techs. So I got on the phone with him. Right away, he was hostile. He gave me the whole "I know what I'm doing, I'm tech savvy" routine, dripping with arrogance. I brushed it off and spent about 30 minutes carefully walking through his setup until eventually I got every single one of his devices connected. But instead of being relieved, he was furious. He ranted nonstop about how incompetent the other employees were, and he even turned that anger on me. I don't remember every insult he threw, but one line I'll never forget was him saying, "Your techs are worthless. You should hang them from their intestines." That one stopped me cold for a second. At that point, I probably should have just ended the call, but I froze up and kept listening. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he demanded that I help him set up his Plex server. That was a hard no, not only because it was against hotel policy, but also because it could be used for illegal streaming. That's when I finally looped in my manager. Together, we called the hotel's general manager and explained the situation while keeping him on hold. She immediately joined the call, and as soon as she spoke, it was like a hammer dropping. She laid into him for the way he had treated the staff, making it crystal clear that this behavior would not be tolerated. He tried defending himself, saying it took too long to fix his issues, but she wasn't buying any of it. She told him he had 2 hours to pack up all his things and leave the property, or she would call the police. He panicked and started begging to stay, saying he had just finished dragging everything he owned into the room and there were no hotels left with space. But she didn't budge. After a final round of scolding, she told me I could disconnect the call. And that was that. The man who had spent nearly an hour cursing us out had been shut down in the most direct way possible. That story wraps up here. What really stands out to me is how fast the general manager flipped the script on him. He went from acting like the most important person in the world to begging just to keep his room. It's rare to see someone get called out and held accountable in real time like that. And honestly, it's one of the most satisfying parts of the whole story. This next story is about tenants battling a stubborn landlord who tried to shortchange them on rent disputes and deposits, only to end up losing big in court. Back in the 80s, I was a couple years out of college when I moved into a small apartment by the shore in New Jersey. The place wasn't fancy, but it worked. Every winter, there was this routine where the heat would come on late. The first few cold days were always miserable until it finally kicked in. Normally, after we told the super, the heat would come through just fine. But one year, things got really bad. By February, the heat wasn't just late. It started cutting out altogether. Inside the apartment, it was in the low 50s, and we were walking around in coats just to stay warm. We told the super, nothing. We wrote the landlord, still nothing. At that point, we checked with an attorney and learned about something called the warranty of habitability. Basically, if the place wasn't livable, we had the right to withhold rent. So, after sending another certified letter, that's what we did. Of course, the landlord filed a motion to evict us, but we responded with a Marini defense, depositing the withheld rent money with the court. When it went before a judge, he sided with us. All the rent we withheld was protected, and we kept living there because options were limited while we saved to buy a home. Fast forward 6 years later, and on our last lease, we slipped in a clause that let us break the lease with 45 days notice, just like the landlord could. We wrote it in a way that blended into the page, and sure enough, they signed it without noticing. When the time came, we gave written notice, paid rent through the 45 days, and moved out. The landlord refused to return our deposit and instead sued us for 6 months' rent. We countersued for double the deposit. This time it wasn't small claims anymore, but we went in without a lawyer. First, we had to sit through arbitration. The arbitrator told us we'd lose and should pay the remainder of the lease. We refused and waited for the judge. While we were waiting, the landlord's attorney strolled over and asked why we hadn't taken the arbitrator's advice. We showed him our lease with the 45-day clause intact. He said it had been crossed out in their copy. That's when we handed him our copy where it wasn't crossed out. His face went pale. He made a call to the landlord and came back offering to break the lease clean and return our deposit. But we pulled out a certified letter we had sent weeks before, saying we'd only accept that deal if they settled without dragging us to court. Now that we were here, we wanted double damages. In the courtroom, the judge looked over both leases, shoved ours toward their attorney and said, "This is the lease in force." Watching their lawyer pace around like a chicken with its head cut off while trying to explain himself was priceless. The judge awarded us double damages. At first, no check came. Then we learned about something called chattel execution, which meant the sheriff could actually seize property from the landlord's office to cover the judgment. We filed for it. Weeks later, a check arrived from the landlord. But a month after that, the court called us again. Turns out the sheriff had already gone to the landlord's office, confiscated equipment, and auctioned it off. The money had been sent to the court. Since we already got paid, the court said they'd just return the extra to the landlord. The best part wasn't just winning. It was knowing the landlord had to sit there in his own office, watching the sheriff cart off equipment to be sold at auction, all for trying to cheat us. That's the end of this story. What really gets me here is how the landlord's arrogance came back around in the most embarrassing way possible. Not only did they lose in court, but they had the sheriff show up and strip their office like a repo job. That's the kind of sting you don't forget. And honestly, it makes the whole thing feel like justice with a little extra flair. This next story is about a scammer who tried to cheat a seller out of thousands of dollars by keeping both the money and the product, only to have the whole scheme collapse back on him in a way that couldn't have been scripted better. A couple of years ago, I had this guy emailing me nonstop about one of my custom arcade machines. He was picky beyond belief and dragged the process out for months, but eventually, he went all in. He ordered an ultra deluxe, 4-player arcade cabinet wrapped in Star Wars graphics. The whole setup came to over $3,000, plus shipping. 5 days later, the machine arrived at his place in Melbourne. That's when I got a furious call. He said the freight company damaged it. I told him not to worry because I fully insured every shipment. I just asked him to send pictures of the damage. When I saw the photos, it was obvious. The damage was tiny. The console had shifted slightly, but it was an easy fix. I offered to send a contractor to repair it at my own expense. He refused. So I offered to have it collected, brought back to me, and give him a full refund. Again, he refused. Then I suggested paying him what I would have paid the contractor, around $250, so he could fix it himself. Still no. What he wanted was the impossible. A full refund while keeping the machine. I explained that insurance would never cover that. It would be like totaling a car for a small scratch. He didn't care. He filed a PayPal dispute claiming the item didn't arrive as described. PayPal froze my account, holding over $3,000. That's how they work. Guilty until proven innocent. I sent PayPal every transcript showing that I offered to fix it or take it back, but the buyer faked a return receipt. PayPal sided with him. Just like that, he had his money and my machine. I was furious. At one point, I almost jumped in my truck to drive the 900 kilometers to his door, but my wife convinced me to stay calm. A few days later, karma started chipping away at him. He emailed me saying the computer inside the machine had failed. I laughed at the nerve of it. Soon after, his IT guy called me about the dead hard drive. I played along and had him ship it back for warranty replacement. Now the guy had a useless shell with no computer. Without it, all he had was an oversized cabinet taking up space. Then came the fake reviews, the calls, the back and forth nonsense. He listed the machine on eBay for $1,100, claiming it was masterfully built and flawless. I recognized it instantly. Using my wife's account, I bought it. When it arrived, I intentionally made it look badly damaged and filed a dispute. Just like he did to me, I demanded a refund. He caved, refunded me in full, and let me keep the cabinet. Now I had my machine back. But the universe wasn't done. PayPal finally reviewed my case in detail. They caught his fake paperwork and his messages where he admitted trying to scam me. They refunded me the original $3,000. At this point, I had my machine back and my money. When he realized what happened, he called me in a rage. I told him it was karma and laughed him off. He begged and pleaded for me to return the money, but I donated it to charity instead. I sent him the receipt just to make sure he knew his scam ended up putting food and clothes on kids instead of lining his pockets. That's where the story ends. What I love about this one is how many twists it took before the tables finally turned. It wasn't just a quick win. It dragged out, and then everything lined up perfectly. In the end, the scammer basically funded charity with his own greed, and that's about as poetic as it gets. Anyways, that's all the stories I have for you today, and I hope it was a chill listen. If you had a good time, dropping a like and hitting that subscribe button really helps me out. And as always, thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you in the next one.